I'm a long-time listener of your show, and I've been trying to figure out where my story could fit in. You've got some pretty incredible accounts told here, and I've noticed that you especially favor Dogman. Well, I've decided to see how my story will go over with you, but it could go over like a lead balloon. I didn't have an experience with Dogman, as you describe them often. I did, however, encounter a wolf-like creature that makes your average timber wolf look like a rat. Some of my business brought me up to the unusually remote and desolate region between Canada and Alaska. I know, it sounds like a bizarre, strange place to have any kind of business to attend, but hear me out. We were experiencing near-total whiteout conditions, and it was catch-22. If we tried to bed down and ride out the night, we would surely freeze. If we continued on our way with the weather being what it was, there was no telling what kind of directionlessness we could end up in and waste our efforts and resources. We made a tentative effort to rest for a very, very short time. I had a shotgun at the ready. Even as remote as our location was, there were always bears to look out for, or so I'm told. Plus, we're also in one of those regions where legends tend to stick. Most of them you couldn't take too seriously, but others made you wonder. Stories about Bigfoot, and things that were just a little too big to be a normal bear or a normal bird. Just one of those places that could easily be hiding, something we arrogantly assumed died out millions of years ago. Due to my heritage, I tend to buy more into the legends of the region, stemming from the days of the Native American tribes that used to occupy the present land. I was dozing off when a sound even louder than the snowstorm had reached me and jarred me awake violently. It sounded like a war zone, when in fact it was our truck being moved by something. And when I say moved, I mean being tossed around like a Hot Wheels toy. I could just barely make out what looked like a living mountain of fur that was being rapidly glazed up by the storm. The bad thing about detailed descriptions in a snowstorm is that the brain attempts to fill in the gaps of what it can't see for sure. That's how snow blindness occurs. It's essentially sensory deprivation, to the point where the brain creates light hallucinations to compensate. In the moment, I was pretty sure that this behemoth of fur had very small ears that were tucking themselves into the monstrous broad head they were attached to. The forehead reminded me of a pit bull. That's where all the other similarities to anything else disappeared. It attempted to look like a wolf trying to be a bear. I know, bizarre, and not as thrilling as Dogman. It wasn't appearing to walk on hind legs, and no, it did not have glowing red eyes. But it possessed a fierce primal rage, and its eyes were visible without a light. I caught its gaze just long enough for it to redirect the anger from the truck over to us. Acting sooner than thinking, I raised the shotgun and let it have both barrels. The sheer size of the monster, as it reared back on its hind legs, still not like a Dogman, made the shotgun feel so ineffective. The thing's head was nearly giant. It swatted at the air, as if that would deflect the buckshot. I reloaded with shaky hands, firing off 2 more rounds. I must have done this several times, because the snow was starting to turn bloody. This monstrous bear-wolf thing took off, not dying, but very much unnerved. That's when we made the decision to keep moving right then and there. Adrenaline and pure terror, scouring my veins, kept me warm for the time being. It also kept me alert, awake, and most importantly, alive. It's one thing to encounter a monster that you've never seen before. It's another to meet that monster entire leagues away from other people, other than your traveling buddies, who are just as puny and clueless as you. Like I said, I did not encounter a Dogman. but this was still a terrifying experience for me. I wish you could see the way I'm shaking as I relive these moments. I love your show, and I'll be listening, and I thought it was important that I added my 2 cents in my own story. To conclude, no, this was not a grizzly bear. Even though it possessed the same size if not larger, it looked vastly different. It looked more like a wolf combined with a bear, if that makes any sense, and had this unnatural viciousness to it. That's the best I can describe. I found myself in a valley, an exceptionally isolated and wild region of Canada. This valley is accessible only by boat or float plane, if that says anything about just how formidable the wilderness is. It does have plenty of springs and geysers, so the valley is almost consistently shrouded in mist. I'm telling you this because it tells you how crazy I was to be dragged out here. I was desperate for money, and the person I was working for was desperate for support. I agreed to a healthy paycheck if I managed to survive. The valley is often referred to as Headless Valley, if that tells you anything. Almost all the bodies that turn up in the place have suffered decapitation. My employer had a crew of about 13 total, including him. A few were like me, in it for the money. The rest were full-blown monster-loving psychos. And for the sake of the story, I'll refer to my employer as John Alpha, just to keep his identity safe. Mr. Alpha planned on having a seance on our very first night, being a very quote-unquote spiritual individual. A heavy rain had him cancel that plan, which was more than fine by me, since I'm a pretty firm atheist. But I'm not a strict materialist either. There was something about that valley that I felt a weird feeling. At least we weren't going to freeze. I was surprised at how comfortable the valley was compared to the rest of the wild, thanks in part to the springs. I could see how animals and the rest of the world couldn't sustain down here, at least as far as hiding goes. Mr. Alpha enthusiastically explained that we were going to set up a mobile production studio in a tent. I suddenly had the feeling of being exposed. No more protection from the evil of the valley than the men that had passed through during their age of gold. I was assigned to go do reconnaissance on the area with a coworker that I'll call John Beta. Again, these aren't real names. I'm just using these to protect the identities of the individuals I had this encounter with. Bear with me. All we got for the job were GoPro cameras and ghost detecting equipment. I swear, this stuff looked like it was made for movie sets, rather than serious paranormal investigation. We began our hike in thick birchwood. We felt that the white bark would make other things easier to see. Also, it felt way too open and exposed if we had decided to stake out in the open. The woods is where all kinds of quote-unquote scary stuff happens. But you would have had to been there to know that feeling that I'm specifically describing. John Beta seemed much calmer than me, and he pointed out how high-strung I was, and that I should afford to relax. I, in turn, pointed out how every dead body that was ever recovered from this valley was decapitated, and that if he didn't believe me, he could simply Google it himself. He didn't. He shook his head. The ghost hunting equipment registered nothing as far as EVPs, and I didn't expect them to either. I tried not to think of all the ways that the valley earned its reputation of being legitimately haunted wilderness. I felt the need to relieve myself, so I ducked down into a natural pit that was lined with grass. I came out just in time to see something that looked equal parts prehistoric and demonic rushing up to my boss. It took his head off with one clean blow. To say that this was massive doesn't do it justice. He clearly didn't see it coming, due to the fact that it was a perfect shade of white to blend in with the surrounding, and the way it had moved with perfect silence was disturbing and chilling. the only detectable noise being was the disgusting sound of his snapping vertebrae. I have never felt that kind of raw, blind terror before in my life. This animal could have easily passed as a massive white wolf, but it was too broad. There were too many features that didn't quite fit. Tiny ears, tiny eyes, a strange long muscly tail sweeping behind it. The head was very large, broad and flat, like a smooth stone you'd find in a riverbed. The creature was busy tearing the flesh off this body. That was the first instance of things going wrong that could be followed by many more. I swore up and down that it was due to the valley being haunted, but Alpha agreed that we would be getting results of the ghost hunting equipment. He was just smart enough to pack us up and leave at the end of all of it before we would be utterly stranded. Listen, I feel like some of the evil energy of that valley has followed me home, and I have to talk about it with somebody. That's why I feel I need to reach out. Maybe my story will serve as a warning that there are some places you should just avoid poking around in. Now, as far as that animal is concerned, I don't know what it was, but I'm glad we survived. I received a gift from my uncle that ultimately came as a surprise. To put it mildly, the guy didn't like me. He never had, even when I was a child. It's one of those enduring family mysteries that never really had any real explanation. It just simply was. When I was well into my adult years, he was a declining old man. He had sent me a letter, the first one in fact I'd ever gotten from him. He was sending me the deed to a plot of land in a forest located deep in Canada, of all places, and supposedly came with a cabin he had hand-built. I looked it over and made some phone calls to make sure it wasn't fake or a hoax. It appeared to be the real deal. Being immediately suspicious. Was this a trap? Not unless he had hired a gang of bandits to hang out. Maybe he felt bad for me. That was sorely unlikely, but it was the only piece that fit. It took me a while to get everything together, but I finally flew out there. It was indeed remote, and he wasn't wrong. It wasn't just situated inside a forest. It was practically swallowed by a forest. I mean, you could easily lose track of how light or dark it was, just because of how dense the woods were. But it was peaceful. It was time to check out the cabin itself, and it may as well have been condemned, but the land was good. I was going to step outside to enjoy some more fresh air when I looked out one of the broken windows, and I froze in place. At first, I saw the bear. It was a black bear, and it was looking straight at me. But here's where it gets weird. There wasn't something quite right about it. The eyes did not look focused, and the head seemed to kind of have a limp. 2 seconds later, I saw the monster that was gripping the black bear in its jaws. I couldn't have told you what it was, but I could tell you that it was enormous, as if a bear and a wolf had begotten offspring together. The bear was dead, and I could not run outside without being seen. I watched as this monster tore this animal in pieces like it was nothing. I was a prisoner for what felt like hours as this large animal ate, far larger than the bear it killed. It's almost as if by some act of God, the thing left. I fled, exhausted from terror, standing there, waiting for the thing to pick up my scent and come after me next. The flimsy front of the cabin wouldn't have even held up if this thing wanted me badly enough. No, I have not contacted my uncle yet to let him know that I survived. However, if I see him again, I'm probably going to let him know what happened. If you're a hiker, a camper, or any sort of outdoor nature enthusiast, there will be certain safety drills what you will have practiced over and over. Everybody knows this. You will know and be educated on what animals to look out for, which plants to avoid. You will recognize danger before it ever happens. And if in the worst case scenario, something goes wrong, you will not only know exactly what to do, but you will have all the necessary equipment. At least this is what I had always thought. I have been outdoorsy my whole life. I would definitely consider myself an expert in all manner of nature and outdoors. I thought, or assumed, that I would be prepared for anything. Not in a vain way, but if I came across a cougar or bear, I'd like to think I would know what to do in order to survive, but I wouldn't start trying to wrestle it to the ground. It's important to know your limitations. Be very aware and safe. I know the correct course of action for almost any animal encounter, except for the thing I'm about to tell you about. It had been very wet, and I almost gave up the idea of a hike that I'd planned. I always wear long tops, tucking my pants into my boots and covering myself in bug spray. Besides, mosquitoes love a good feast, so you need to be careful. And of course, they love hot, damp, humid weather, even more so after a storm. I had planned this particular hike for ages and needed to be there at a certain time to take a photo of a very specific plant, which should be in bloom at the time. Against my better judgment, I went. Again, proving you shouldn't always listen to your instincts. But that day I didn't. I was about halfway through the hike, and very close to where this particular plant should be, when I heard a loud buzzing. I was already smothered in spray, and was very liberally reapplying every half hour or so. I swear, you must have been able to smell the plants for miles around. I was aware of the buzzing, but pretty confident at the point that nothing would want to come near me. There shouldn't be any bees, wasps, or hornets around me, and most other bugs would be as intended, repelled by me. The closer I got to the spot where this plant should be, the louder the buzzing and flapping appeared. I could even feel a slight breeze. As I parted the branches, I very suddenly became aware what was making the buzzing. If you can imagine there being a giant bug, the size of a small human, standing, then maybe you would have ever seen the fly. If you can imagine there was a giant bug, the size of a small adult, standing there, on two legs, very reminiscent of the movie The Fly. If I had to guess, I'd say about 5 feet tall. It had a long, thin body, with bendy legs, very similar to that of a grasshopper, but also very humanoid looking. It had long wings which were constantly moving, and the fact that it stood on two legs was terrifying. Its head kind of reminded me of an ant or a grasshopper, very bugged out, no pun intended. It was also black and bright green. It looked more alien-like, to be honest, than it did a giant insect. It didn't quite seem to notice me, so I very, very slowly let the branches fall back in place and turn around as carefully as I could, creeping very quiet for a minute or two so I could be sure it hadn't heard or even sensed me. And then I ran with everything that I am. The most annoying thing about it now is that I had my camera in my hand to take a photo, but then, if I had taken the picture, would it have possibly noticed me and even pursued coming after me? I guess that's a question I'll never know the answer to. I worked security at a department store in Detroit. This was back before all the craziness and the riots, even before COVID. It was one of the roughest places to run a business, so my job involved checking outside as much as in, and there were always weirdos and drifters about, but rarely did I ever see anybody that looked like they were going to try and get inside. I had been lulled into a false sense of security, since my job and my life revolved around the inner city. I never planned on seeing anything too outlandish, besides druggies and muggers. I mean, I never planned on showing up to work and suddenly being mauled by a lion. You expect that threats in the world will fit inside a very predictable bubble. Making my regular rounds one night, I stepped outside to do my usual, check for any prowlers or drug deals potentially going on. Well, more so prowlers. It was all clear, except for the door that opened into a narrow alley, and it was pretty narrow. There wasn't room for more than 2 people to walk beside each other, let alone room for a car. It was a little bit thinner than a single lane, I guess. The light of the street lamp got in just far enough to light up the feet of 2 people that must have been standing face to face. Then there was a soft, wet sound, like they were kissing it up. They were in shadows from the knees up, and they were just a little too close to the door for comfort. I lit up my flashlight and trained it on them. I was about to tell them to move when I saw that they weren't indeed kissing. One of them was eating the face off the other, holding them firmly in place when the light got the attacker's attention. It turned to me, and I wish it hadn't. It wasn't even remotely human. It had wicked-looking mouth parts, something like mandibles. The eyes were black and large. I didn't get to study it for but a second, since I screamed and fell backwards. I don't know why it didn't turn on me. As soon as I could think straight, I got to looking stuff up. Turns out there was a so-called Mantis Man that had been sighted around New Jersey, but it was never reported really on much. I was reminded of the incident involving bath salts in Miami, and I considered the possibility that I somehow imagined the inhuman features of the one person since their face was smeared with blood. I'm at a dead end for rational explanations, and I'm also at my wit's end for my mental health. That was a very brief encounter, but I'm still pretty shaken up over it. If I approached a counselor, they'd probably have me committed. So who can I talk to and tell my story to? So I'll possibly pass this on to you. Maybe you can help me. Most of the stories I hear are things about Bigfoot, or ghosts, or something like that. Well, I saw something driving home one night that is even scarier than Bigfoot. Mainly because I have never liked bugs. They're disgusting. I don't think that I'm afraid as such. I will happily squish one. They just gross me out. Anyway, I'm not here to talk to you about my innate disgust of bugs. I want to tell you what I saw. I was driving home one evening. It was late in the summertime, and although beginning to get dark, not totally yet. In fact, that's one of the things I do love about summertime, is it stays bright out till at least 9 or 10 p.m. So I was totally minding my own business when I heard a thumping sound from the roof. I wasn't driving too fast, so maybe it was a bird, but I'm not sure. Whatever it was still up there, on my roof as I'm driving. I thought, what the hell? I picked up speed. Now I'm in 2 minds about what to do. Should I stop, halt the brakes and hope it flies off? What if it hurts? Or should I just carry on and ignore it, hoping it solves itself? That's when I started to hear this loud buzzing. It must have been loud, because I could hear it over the car engine. A buzzing and banging noise accompanied together. Now, I was starting to get pretty worried. It made one final bang, and then I catch a glimpse out the windshield. Something flying off. This thing was humongous. It reminded me of a dragonfly, or a grasshopper, or a praying mantis. But it looked wrong. Not only was it incredible size, but it looked too much like a person. And instead of being green or black, or whatever color insects are, it was pale white, kind of like an albino insect, or so is what I got out of it. I floored it, never having driven home faster. When I got home, I frantically checked the top of my car, covered in all these weird scratches, and this bizarre light green goop. It had a weird stench to it too. I just washed it off right away. And so far, since then, I have never seen this creature or insect, whatever it could have been. Thank God. I was walking home from a very heavy night of drinking. I live in downtown Chicago. It probably wasn't a very smart thing for me to do, walking alone, intoxicated. But hey, I was at the point of being drunk that every single place I passed looked like it could have been my house. I knew that wasn't good, but I was too drunk to care. It was a very still night, and it was so late that there was barely anybody else on the sidewalk. I felt a breeze that should have raised some alarms in my head, since it appeared to have a rhythm to it. It wasn't just a steady stream or whoosh of air. It was kind of a whoomp, 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 whoomp kind of sound, rather than a solid breeze. I just happened to look up and see something that literally sobered me up any quicker than a cop pulling me up and trying to arrest me. Something with the shape of a large man with wings appeared to be hovering in the air, nearly 20 to 30 feet above my head. Being dark, I wasn't able to discern every feature, and somehow, in my intoxicated haze, the details of this thing stuck out to me clearly. I made out large red eyes, no pupils, and a dark, very weird body. I could tell it was training its gaze on me. I felt this deep fear inside the core of my body. It was danger. I felt, had I stayed there, I would have died. I ran as fast as I could, screaming. This thing keeping pace with me overhead, without a problem. I ended up running into a tree, knocking myself unconscious, and nearly getting a concussion from it. I woke up and was still in front of the tree, but I was by myself and luckily didn't have any serious injuries. It began tickling into the news that the supposed Mothman had been sighted in Chicago, a long way away from its usual home of the southern states. Now, I don't know much homework you do about the Mothman, but I want you to know that there have been numerous accounts and sightings of the Mothman being over the Chicago, Illinois area. I don't know if that's what I saw. I don't know if that has anything to do with what I saw, but I know I want nothing to do with what I saw that night. And just to clear things up, even though I was intoxicated, I am 100% behind what I saw. There's no backing down. I wasn't too drunk. I know for a fact that I saw this thing and I felt it. There's no way to explain looking at this thing and sobering up so quickly. It is one of the things that has terrified me to my very core. I never want to feel that again. Back in 2017, I went on a family vacation to Fairfield Bay, Arkansas. We were staying in a raised cabin. I was maybe 5'7" at the time, and could comfortably stand under it. I had a golf hole for a golf course behind, which was alongside of a forest. The first day we were there was great. We went back to the cabin, and we got our stuff unpacked. I was staying in the loft above the living room. It had windows above the roof to look out of like a split-level roof situation. I turned off the TV and went to bed, no problem. I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason. I lay on my side so I have a straight shot out the window across from my sister. In that window was this pale, emaciated humanoid thing sitting on the lower roof. I froze in fear, willing myself not to move in fear that this thing would try to get in. It cupped its hands around its face, like people do, trying to see out a window into the dark. It sat there and just watched for a minute, that felt like an eternity until the thing turned and crawled on all fours down the side of the cabin, presumably back to the woods. I sat there, still frozen for another minute or two, just to be sure that this thing was gone. The only thing keeping me from running to my parents' room was that the entire living room was lined with curtainless windows, and the thing just crawled down that way. I had to turn the TV on to get back to bed that night. The thing was about child size, and I am positive an adult would have problems scaling that cabin. You can imagine how sleeping in that cabin felt for the other 5 days. I couldn't sleep in my parents' room because they didn't believe me. They said it was just a bad dream, but it wasn't because the TV was still on when I woke up. I had to sleep there for the rest of the trip, waking up at around the same time every night, then having to turn on the TV just to get back to sleep. I carried the fear of this thing for years, thinking I would see it in my basement window or down the street from me when taking out the trash at night. Watching shows with things that looked like that almost put me to tears. And trust me, I don't scare very easily. That is, until I found more information about it. I don't feel as much of that fear now, but it's still there, always at the back of my mind. Thank you for reading. It makes me feel so much better about this event, whether I can just talk about it to you or anybody. I don't normally encourage this type of stuff, and I've always been a firm ignorance is bliss kind of guy. I've seen ghosts before, and spirits, and it never really bothered me, because simply, I would just shut it out and carry on with my day. However, there is one encounter that I have never been able to forget, and it still freaks me out to this day. I live in the U.K., and used to live in a nice area just outside of a big city. It was sort of in the countryside, but not. There was always this one part of the woods that just gave weird vibes, unexplainable, and the feeling that you shouldn't be there. 420, me and a few friends thought it would be a good idea to go to the spot, as we referred it to, and get set up in a tent and have a good time. It probably got to around 1 a.m, and being tired and stoned, I decided to just walk home, since I lived 10 minutes away. I remember I left by myself, and started on the path home. The area where we had set up was wooded, a lot of high bushes, and a good mile away from any house. It's also near an army firing range. I don't know if this is important. I remember walking down the path, flashlight on my phone shining the way, when I felt what I can only describe as pure fear. It felt like my whole body was telling me I had to leave this area as fast as I could, or else I was going to end up dead. Now, I know this could have been weed making me paranoid, but when I used to smoke, I never experienced anything like this. I started running as fast as I could, and I could hear what sounded like galloping running behind me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, and I could feel it was getting closer to me, and that I was in imminent danger. I managed to get to the clearing, which was about 100 meters near the main road, and as soon as I got there, quickly turned around to see what it was chasing me, and I just remember seeing this tall, pale, bony creature standing still at the top of the clearing, watching me closely. It must have been easily 8 feet tall, had massive eyes that reflected light. I never told anybody what I saw, simply because I knew nobody would believe me, and every time I walked past that clearing, I still felt like I was being watched. However, a few years later, my friend and I were discussing paranormal events. I told him what had happened, and we decided to go there. Luckily this time during the day and light. We got to the area and ventured in deeper, only complaining we got a weird vibe, but nothing to be concerned about. However, as we got deeper, we came across what can only be described as a tunnel of trees that led to a round clearing with a single tree growing in the middle. Nothing else. All other vegetation was dead. As we started to walk through this tunnel, what can only be described as a face appeared through the vegetation, staring at us. We both got a good look at it, and we saw a long sunken face, large jet black eyes staring at us, with slits for a nose. We bolted and got out of there. To this day, we haven't spoken about it, and I just want to know what it was. Somehow, I know it was watching and observing. It was definitely predatory. It is a thing of pure evil. I can feel it. So, this story is from a few years ago, but me and my mother remember every single detail of what happened, and I would appreciate some advice. I am almost 100% sure I saw a skinwalker, but the location just doesn't add up. Could this be a crawler? I was about in 7th or 8th grade at the time, and me and my mother were driving home from a therapy, approaching a mine. It was winter and a full moon, because I remember the snow glowing under the moon. It was only 6, but really dark out because, it's in the middle of wintertime. So we're going about 55 miles an hour. That's when this thing crosses and stops in front of us. The only way I can describe it is that if you combined a deer, a dog, and a human, it stood about as tall as our windshield. It had the legs of what I can describe as a deer, and its back was hunched over and walking on all fours. It appeared to have the head of a dog, but it didn't have the ears or dog nose. But its eyes were white, and it did not have a tail. The freakish thing about this creature was its skin. It wasn't a canine with mange or anything. It had actual human skin, all the way down its legs, too long to be dog legs. It smelled of rotting meat, and some parts of its flesh appeared broken open, like if you would scrape your knee really bad. It was pale white, and you could even see its veins. This thing, it was fast, like it stood there and just ran across the road in the blink of an eye. Me and my mother had to pull over to calm down. We both saw it. This sighting was in southeastern Ohio. Thanks to somebody else, I know what I believe now is that I saw a crawler. I haven't seen the creature since, but it still haunts me to this day, and on that highway, I'm scared to see it again, and I almost wonder how many others in the area have seen anything similar, or even in other states, if there have been supposed similar sightings of what I've seen. I'm not exactly sure. Sometimes I even question myself, was I really just seeing things, or did this creature appear in front of us? As always, thanks. I bought my first $1 million mansion in Fresno, California. It's not that I'm the type that likes to show off with my means of living. It's more like I came from a background where I had less than nothing, and I would be damned if my own children would grow up in the same childhood that I had. So, needless to say, my developmental years were spent developing a strong sensitivity to who I allowed in my bubble and who I did not. This basically made me an adult who put up fences and had zero tolerance for anyone who didn't belong behind them. You step onto my property uninvited, and there's going to be fireworks. I landed this mansion, and I made sure that security was a priority. I set up an entire network of cameras, and I personally would monitor them from my phone. I had it set up so that I would get an alert every time there was movement. Needless to say, you can imagine my phone went off constantly. But I didn't pay much mind unless my phone was going off at hours of the day when it really shouldn't have been. Like in the dead of night, when my phone began going off, and I got up and opened the app. The footage was indistinct, but it looked like they were a pair of people that must have been wearing light-colored pants with dark clothes, because their pants were all I could see. They must have also either been drugged or drunk. Their gait was rather swaying and staggering. From the moment I saw the footage, I immediately entered fight or flight, leaning heavy on the fight part. While they kept coming back, my phone kept going off around the same time every night. So, you know what? I decided it was time to catch them in person. The fact that they kept wearing light-colored pants and dark-colored tops made me wonder, could this be a local gang? They seemed to skirt at the edge of my pond, at the edge of my property, so that's where I waited for them. I had the line of a full moon with me, so I was able to see clearly if they still wore the same clothes as they did the last couple of times. Luckily, I didn't have to wait long. They showed up around the same time frame, a little bit after midnight. Sure enough, their pants were lighting up like bone, gleaming in the moonlight. I practically jumped out of my lawn chair to go confront them, but I stopped short. I was heading under the shadow of a tree, so I doubt they saw me, but I got a really good clear look at them. I was only able to ever see their pants on camera, because that's all there was. I know that sounds ridiculous, but there was nothing but a waist and a set of long legs and feet. There was no torso. I remember my throat constricting. I couldn't even yell. I immediately got to doing some sort of research, and it turned out that I saw these things that are referred to as Fresno Nightcrawlers. Apparently they're a rare sight, but I guess I was lucky to host their nighttime activities. They would pass through my yard for the next 3 weeks before they were gone and never come back. I could not explain to you the chill that would come over me whenever my phone would go off a little bit after midnight. I knew what app it was, and I knew what it would show me if I pulled it up. They didn't look threatening, but they didn't appear friendly either. I thought it best to just avoid them. Anyway, I'm not really a scary story or paranormal guy, but I felt that my recent experiences were worth sharing. Thank you. My prized possession was a treehouse that my father had built me. It felt like a castle that set up on a grand old oak, and it was big enough to practically be a foundation for a smaller house, let alone a treehouse. It's not at the farthest corner of our yard, so I felt like I was the king of my own little empire, being able to see all of our yard and a great deal of what was beyond the fence. There was a lot of rolling prairie land, with a tree line of vast forest at the very edge. The forest was so far away that it wasn't like I could just walk out of there, and that's beside the fact that it was not our property. My parents are really good at keeping me involved. They didn't like the idea of having an idle child, so I relished the moments that I can spend in the treehouse, because that was pretty much my vacation from the garage of things that my parents set up for me to do, and I often spent that time sleeping. It was during one of those naps that I woke up to the sound of snuffling and sniffing. Not unlike the sound you'd expect from a dog, but it seemed too loud, especially since I could hear from the inside of the treehouse, and the source of it was outside, somewhere. Fear took hold of me when I turned around and looked out one of the windows of my treehouse, and then I saw a pair of eyes looking at me. They were set into a head that was vaguely human, except the head was upside down. Whoever it was, they were on top of my treehouse, hanging down, looking at me through the window. I could only see them from the bridge of the nose to the top of their bald head, eyes wide open, as they were full of mania or surprise. The eyes were wide open, and a pure white color. I took all these details in about 1 second, and then this thing quickly pulled back and disappeared. I could hear it scrambling on top of my treehouse roof, the movement sounding very frenzied and quick, with sudden halting between movements, almost as if it was moving around like a spider on the hunt. In those heartbeats of stillness, I heard a clicking sound. I then held my breath until I couldn't anymore, and I was gasping for air, even though I was trying not to. I looked over to the door of my treehouse. I had left it open, and as quietly as I possibly could, I moved over and shut it. No sooner had the knob latched into place, and something on the other side grabbed hold of it, rattling it violently. I held onto it and held it for dear life. The tug-of-war eventually stopped, and there's the sound of a little bit of me scrambling on top of the shuffling and chomping that went completely silent. Holding my position for what felt like hours, and my legs underneath me were beginning to go to sleep, but I didn't dare move a muscle. I then heard the sound of my dad's voice, calling out my name. I wanted so badly to answer him, but I felt like I couldn't. I didn't want to risk the possibility of drawing the attention of that thing, or whoever was to me again. I only answered him when it sounded like he was right outside. He wasn't being attacked, so I reasoned that I wouldn't be either. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost, because my dad's expression changed as soon as I got sight of him. He asked me what was wrong, and to my surprise, I couldn't form a whole sentence. All I could do at the time was let out a strange, strained wheeze. I stayed that way, clear up until bedtime, when my parents were thinking of taking me to the ER. I broke down, told them what I saw, what I heard, and began crying. They simply just exchanged looks, but I couldn't tell if it was because they thought I was nuts, or because they knew something. They clearly didn't voice their thoughts either way. And after that pretty much killed my treehouse fun. I tried to make myself go in there and enjoy myself like I had before, but it just wasn't the same. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't feel in charge of my own safety. So, I just gave it up. This is going to be a bit long, but I'm seriously terrified and need help. I'll start off by saying I've never believed in anything paranormal. I'm a pretty science-based dude. I always look for a logical explanation, and I still am for this encounter. So if you have any ideas, I would love to know. I don't have much time for leisure with work recently. Been having to accept some pretty awful shifts to get away with COVID-19 times. I've lost my ability to go on my evening walks, which are a method of stress relief for me. It had been a while since I had gone on one, so 3 nights ago, I decided to just go for a late night walk. Put on my headband flashlight, and decided to take a path that I had not in ages. There's actually a small trail near the back of my neighborhood that goes roughly 4 miles deep into the woods. My plan was to walk about 1.5 miles and then take the parallel path to come back. I make it down to about 1.3, according to my Fitbit, and I start getting that feeling that I'm being watched. I turn off my headlight, sit, and listen. At this point, I'm more concerned there's a guy following me who is up to no good. I heard clear footsteps in the leaves off the trail, and they've been behind me nearly 5 minutes. I stopped thinking it was an animal or another walker and became worried. Sitting there for probably 3 to 4 minutes, and I hear nothing. I turned back on my headlight and decided to start walking quickly back home. About 2 minutes later, I hear more footsteps. But this time it sounds different. It sounded like 4 feet instead of 2, and it's walking at the same increased speed that I am. I turn around quickly with my headlight and my phone light and point it behind me. Silence. I get angry and yell out, "Leave me alone. I'm gonna call the cops. And if you come at me, I have a knife." More silence. I yell again to get the hell out of there and start walking towards where I heard the walking. About 20 yards out, which was hard to fully make out because the flashlight doesn't reach too far, I see what looks like a literal naked man running full speed on all fours into the woods. Normally, I'd chalk that up to drugs, but my area does not have a drug problem, and there were some details that led me to believe it was not a person. For one, they were damn near hairless. I'm talking completely bald, pale white skin, and the way it ran on all fours looked natural. Not like when you try to run on all fours and look stupid. It looked like its literal bone structure was designed that way. There were no hunched look. Their back was flat, and they were fast. The last thing that happened was straight out of a horror movie. I hadn't heard anything in a while on my way back, but kept turning around just to be sure. With about 0.3 miles left to go until I was in the clear, I hear a mad dash through the leaves. I whip around, and it stops on a dime. I see the edges of its head behind a tree and yell out loudly in an attempt to intimidate. What I heard next, I'll never forget. It cackled like a monkey. A noise I've literally only heard in nature documentaries. The tone was that of a mockery, a predator having fun with me. Safe to say I didn't stick around. I sprinted as fast as possible back home. Listen, I would love to believe this was some sort of prank, or some rabid, bald, diseased coyote, but I got a pretty clear look at it, and it wasn't human. It did have human feet and hands, a human head, and even a human buttocks, but nothing else about it was human. I called the cops after and told them a man was following me. I didn't want to say some creature because they'd think I was crazy. They didn't find anything, but they did see quite a bit of activity in the leaves and dirt, about 50 feet from where the trail was, leading far back into the woods before it got to a large stretch of grass where no footprints could be seen. Please tell me I'm crazy, or that this was some elaborate prank, or possibly a deformed man. My grandmother has some pretty incredible stories. She has always lived on a ranch-type property and kept chickens, goats, sheep, and all to sell and produce for her own consumption. She would tell us about how sometimes she would wake up and find one of her sheep or goats dead. They had been killed. Not taken, but actually killed. And not mauled and eaten, like you might expect from a coyote or even a wolf. Their body, the strangest thing, would be perfect, except for puncture wounds on their neck, and their bodies would be bone dry, like a husk, because they were completely drained of all blood. For a long time, she wondered and pondered what on earth could do such a thing. There was never any commotion in the night. She wasn't woken at 3 a.m. by chickens squawking or goats and sheep making a ruckus. Whatever was doing this seemed to be using the utmost stealth. That's the most scary part. She did attempt staying up a few times to see if the culprit would appear, but as if it knew it was being watched, nothing ever happened when she was on her guard. She did employ a local boy to hide and keep watch a couple of times, but again, it was as if whatever was doing it knew somehow that it was a trap and did not come when it had a captive audience, so to speak. Finally, one night, the boy comes running in, looking terrified, and Grandma, a while to calm him down, was able to tell her what happened. He told her that he had seen this animal or creature killing the animals, that somehow she must be cursed, because this creature was not of this earth. The boy had been hiding in the dark and nearly given up for the night when he heard a strange rustling from where the sheep were sleeping. Quietly, he crept further along in the shadows so he couldn't be seen but was closer. They were all resting, or so it appeared. Not one of them seemed to notice or be worried by any noise. Then, the boy apparently saw something he would never forget. His description is that the size was around 5 feet tall, and despite the gorging on the blood, was deathly skinny, gaunt even. Apparently it walked on 2 feet, was hunched over, and could clearly see a row of long, thin spines upon its back. Completely hairless, similar to that of a naked mole rat, I guess. Its skin looked like it had some sort of disease or mange. The head was dog-like, but also human-like. Huge, large oval black eyes, and a mouth full of sharp teeth. It used those sharp teeth to apparently bite into the neck of these sheep. The boy was paralyzed in fear, able to hear it gulping and pulling out the blood of these animals. Once it had finished, it left the bone-dry corpse and fled. Only then was the boy able to run back to the house to tell what he had seen. They were never sure exactly what the creature had been that he talked about, and the boy refused to ever step foot on that property again, no matter how much my grandmother offered to pay him. But for some reason, after that night, the creature did not return. The only possible explanation she could offer was that it knew that it had been spotted. It knew now that they knew about it, and so apparently it moved on to another ranch or farm or someplace it could eat freely. If it really was some not-of-this-world beast, it would sort of make sense that once it had been seen, it lost some of that power. But who truly knows? My grandmother's now long passed, but this was a tale she told me that terrified me anytime she talked about it. The boy she hired was a young 15-year-old farm boy from nearby. He had known my grandmother for quite some time. She had expressed to me just how much trust she had in him. So, unless he is making it up, then my grandmother is wrong. But judging from my grandmother recalling the event and how she explained how terrified this boy was, I seriously doubt this was some elaborate prank or hoax. Creepy. One day, I was out taking a walk. And by taking a walk, I mean hiking through the desert, as I live in New Mexico. I had just started off this new fitness program after a buddy had taken us all by surprise after having a thankfully non-fatal heart attack. It just sort of gave me that you need to get off your butt and get your heart of yours fitter kind of nudge. So, there I was, in the stifling heat, telling myself that this was good for me. I'm not an idiot with a death wish. Quite the opposite, actually. It was fairly early in the morning, so the sun was still rising, and the heat was stifling, yet nowhere near as intense as it would be later. The area in which I was walking through was a proper trail, but was very rocky, and it wasn't unusual to come upon the odd goat or other harmless creature. There were always coyotes around too, but usually they leave people alone. When I stumbled upon a dead goat, just lying in the path, it wasn't the biggest shock. There were some pretty steep rocks and hills, and I guess one could easily fall down and injure itself. But if you know anything about goats, well, they're not exactly clumsy creatures when it comes to climbing. It did look an odd color, though, that might not make a lot of sense. It looked more pale than usual, and also really stiff, obviously, since it was dead, just like you might expect a body to be. But I noticed it was completely undamaged. No sign of any broken legs or neck, and no blood from any wound. In fact, upon first glance, it appeared as if it would just drop dead. I don't know why that bothered me so much. So I took a closer look, curious as to how this goat supposedly died. And there, hidden away, I had to really look for it. Appeared to be small holes on its neck, and drained of blood. My first thought were vampires, but vampires don't exist, and they only pull the blood out of humans. So how did I explain these 2 puncture holes on its neck? I actually remember thinking and looking over my shoulder, expecting to see some dude in a cape turning into a bat and flying off. Ridiculous, I know. But when you're in the moment, how do you explain that? I did catch a glimpse of something, though, up on the rocky hill, that appeared to be watching me. I'm not sure I've ever been so scared. As soon as I realized this thing was watching me, this fear came over me. Did I really think it was Count Dracula? No, because it wasn't, nor did it look like it. But it was something that wasn't human nor animal. The only way I can describe it was that it looked like some kind of upright, hairless dog. It was really skinny, and looked to be not having a decent meal in a long time. When I first saw it, it looked more animal-like, but then the more it began moving, its movements didn't look anything an animal would make. Again, standing up on 2 legs, just like a person. I could also see more clearly that it had very large black eyes, and apparently large spines from its shoulders and back. I'm no expert on animals or dogs, but I'm pretty sure that there is no natural occurring animal to have those kind of spikes out of its skin. I didn't know what to think. I left it there on the hill, this dog who thought he was a person with his spiny, spiky back. What on earth was I looking at? I ran the hell out of there, not trying to worry about too much of who and what and when. I'll figure that out later. I'm just glad this thing made no attempt to follow me. Who knows what that would have turned out to be. To give you some information, we live in Texas, and chupacabras here are common knowledge around these areas. We are as wary of them as regular predators like coyotes and wolves, and whatever else lives around here. Now, even though I consider them predators, I don't believe we actually have wolves in the state, but coyotes, yes, and mountain lions in certain areas, yes. You can usually tell the difference, too, in a killing. Coyotes and other predators tend to make hell of a mess, eating most of the cadaver or dragging it away, or leaving part of the hide behind. You wake up to one of these killings, and you got bits of blood and animal carcass all over. But if the chupacabra has been to visit, you'll find dead livestock with virtually no mess. If you were to ask me which one of those predators I would rather face on a dark night alone, with or without a weapon, I'd say give me anything over a chupacabra. A bear, a puma, I'd rather face that. I know I can shoot and kill one of those critters. The blood-sucking fiend, though, I believe it's something not of this world. A demon. And, thankfully, it wasn't on our land, but I saw one once, and I very much know they're real. I am, unfortunately, aware of their existence. We had decided to get rid of the remaining goats and chickens we had. My mother was far too upset when she kept finding them dead, drained of blood. They never kicked up a fuss to alert us. They would make a racket, warning each other, calling for help if a coyote was nearby. But we always knew when we had been visited by this creature. When I finally saw one, I was actually taking the dog for a walk. That was one animal I insisted that we keep, although we always kept him inside at nighttime. He is quite a lively one, abounds of energy, and often needs long walks where he runs about for ages, making me tired. This day, though, he had been darting in and out of the trees suspiciously, sniffing at everything, as if we didn't come to the same woods every single day. He is a very happy dog, but in a friendly look at me, I've only ever seen him growl a couple of times, and he was either hurt or trying to protect me. So, When I saw him go rigid, ears down, teeth bared, low growl, tail between his legs, I knew he had seen something that terrified him and made him think I needed protection. He began barking furiously, and then almost instantaneously changed from an angry bark to a petrified whine, came running over to me and hid. I was of course concerned at what on earth could cause my big, brave boy to act like this, but also curious, since every single chupacabra story or sighting I've ever heard about locally was in the night. That never crossed my mind. I was walking slowly over to where the dog had been, and I got the shock of my life. Standing way behind the trees, not close enough to be an immediate threat, but near enough to cause concern and for me to get a good look at it. The best way I can describe it to you, it was shorter than me, but around the size of my mother, so maybe 5 foot. It stood upright, just like me. There was no mistaking it. I have heard people say or report that it reminds them of a rabid dog. I would say there were canine similarities. Its body was completely devoid of any hair, and it looked to have rough, saggy skin. Very mangy looking too. Either that or it had some sort of skin disease. It was ugly. Long gangly limbs, and even appeared to have claws that it drug behind it, as if it had arms and hands too long and big for its body that it had to drag behind it. Very weird. It had sharp-looking spikes coming from around its shoulders and its back, and even had large fangs protruding from its mouth, as if they were fake teeth put in that were too big for its own mouth. This thing was freaky looking, as well as ugly. The head, well, I don't know if you've ever seen the show American Dad, where there's an alien character named Roger. Well, even though it's just a cartoon, this alien Roger has a very large alien head. Well, the head was kind of like that. Very bulbous and oversized for its body. Gray, too. That's immediately what I thought of when I saw this thing's head. Except the face was entirely different. Large, and I mean large black eyes. Not beady in any way. I couldn't make out any nose, but again, the sharp teeth. It just stood staring at me. It might sound overdramatic, but I truly felt that if I stayed there, it would attack us. The air around me just felt wrong. It was almost like a haze or a static electricity in the air. I wasn't sticking around to find out, and thankfully, my dog didn't need any persuasion. Since then, though, I have not seen it around, thankfully, and I hope it never comes back. We have family in Florida, so most summers we enjoy taking a long, leisurely drive down there to stay with them for quite some time. We have seen all sorts of weird and wonderful sights on those drives. We'll see something and all call it out. After all, it only happens in Florida. But they have all been fun, weird, silly, odd, and downright hilarious. We have only ever seen 2 things that have scared us on those long drives. One time, we drove past what looked like a carjacking. Rightly or wrong, Dad put his foot on the gas, and we sped past as fast as we could. No way we were going to try and stop and help when we saw guns. Mom did call 911 though. We're not heartless. That scared us all, and for days after, I kept thinking they'd seen the plates. So much so, I made Dad buy an overpriced Disney vanity plate, just so they couldn't track us down. As scary as that was, you just need to turn on the news to hear it. The other time we were all freaked out. That's the kind of thing they don't tend to show you on the news. Our family ain't in Orlando or even Jacksonville. They live in the part of Florida that most tourists don't likely even know exist. There's lots of swampland, and you gotta be really careful about gators. But I feel like most Floridans know that. Everybody where they live knows that. We all know that from our hours we spent driving. So when we first saw the gator on the side of the road, we were glad we were all in the car. But of course, seeing a gator that up close and knowing you are safe being inside a hunk of metal, my brother was all like, drive past real slow so I can see his teeth. You know, the kind of thing only a 10-year-old boy would say. It was kind of funny. Like maybe had it broken a limb or something, and he wanted to see if it was all gnarly. Of course, my dad, who oftentimes still thought he was a 10-year-old boy too, did just that. We slowed right down to drive past and get a good look at this thing, when all of a sudden, it stands up completely on two legs. The reason it had been walking funny was because it had long legs, not like what belongs on gators at all. So it stands up on those not right legs and looks right at us. And I swear, my entire family gasped in unison as we noticed its eyes were like that of a person. Its head and neck should by rights be stuck up in the air, but no. It bends like a person, so its eyes and mouth are looking right at us. Then it opens its huge jaws and takes a run towards the car. At this point, my little brother and I are crying, screaming. Mom in the front is telling our father to get out of there. And thankfully, that's just what he does, flooring the car, leaving us nearly wrecked. My mother said it gave chase for a while, but gladly it gave up. That's one of the worst memories I've ever had in my life. In fact, my family and I don't even really talk about it. It's not exactly traumatic, but it's something we don't like to acknowledge, I guess, if you want to say that. A little later on in life, when I would learn more about the people and the natives that live in this area of the world, Florida and the South, I would learn that I guess there are supposed rituals that would turn some of the tribesmen into humanoid reptilian beings, or reptilian shapeshifters, I guess if you want to call it that. My thoughts and memory immediately put me back to that memory I just recalled for you, and I wonder, did we run into one of those things that was scouring the swamp? We'll never know. I was driving home from work one night when I saw somebody standing at the side of the road. To start with, I thought it might have been a hitchhiker, and my first thought was, who the hell these days wants to be picked up by a stranger? They were facing away from me, and I found it a little odd that they didn't seem to notice my car was coming towards them. Not that I was going to directly hit them. There was plenty of space, but I found it strange that they did not even turn towards me when they saw my lights. It was pretty dark at this point. Then, as I got closer, I began to notice something very weird about this person. At first, because it was dark, I thought they were dressed in dark military clothing. There was a lot of green and brown, but as I get closer, it looked nothing like clothing. Then, it, and I say it because I realized it was not a person, it looked and turned at me. Its body didn't move, just its head. And honest to God Almighty, the best way I'm able to describe it would be to say it was a lizard person. Simple. It was tall like a man, which was why I had first assumed it to be a human. It was entirely naked. It seemed to be covered in a weird slime, I guess. It had long, slender legs, and the head of a very elongated lizard. Like a damn huge lizard. It didn't move its body at all, just the head, with unblinking eyes as my car drove past. And yes, you can bet I put my foot down on the gas and drove, and I drove. I looked in my mirror, just so I could see from my taillights that it never moved. It just remained there, staring at my car as I disappeared. I'll never forget that night, knowing there are other animals out there that exist, beyond my comprehension. I'm a sanitation technician in the Florida waterways. I'll leave the town I work for out of it, since I don't want anything to trace back to me, and potentially risk losing my job and career, especially in times of COVID-19. Everybody knows the economy is strained enough with all the joblessness. I really wish not to be counted among them. Anyway, sanitation technician. It's just a fancy way of saying that if you have a problem in your sewer in Florida, I'm most likely the guy that has to take care of it. Yay. I mean, we've all heard the stories about crocodiles in sewers. It's not exactly impossible. And chances are the story that you've heard isn't true. But that doesn't mean that those scaly things have never set foot inside. But I have a story for you that's more true than any of the stories that you've ever heard. Well, my story is also going to be less believable than anything you've ever heard. So bear with me. Some parts of town were experiencing flooding some time ago, specifically their basements, and other signs that the sewers were backing up. This was puzzling, because it was during a very dry spell. Well, dry for the Florida area. So naturally, they sent me and a few others to do underground work to investigate. You would think that in this line of work, which is oh so critical, there would be more state-of-the-art equipment that would help us. There was tons of trial and error, searching down in the dark with all the million things that are above ground. It didn't take us long to find out what was obstructing the flow of water. We just weren't sure what to make of it. And at first, we thought that they were rocks, but they appeared too round and too consistent in size. The first thing I thought when I saw them is they kind of looked like very, very large crocodile eggs, or alligator eggs. I always intermix the two, but it's important to note, as a Florida native, to those who read this, that no, crocodiles do not live in Florida. It's only alligators, at least to my knowledge. But anyway, what kind of animal gets into the sewers and lays eggs, especially of this size? I'm kidding you not. They were shy of being the size of literal basketballs, which would mean that there is an enormous mama alligator somewhere. I mean, I guess it's not too unheard of to have a 50-foot alligator, maybe in a movie, but not here in reality. So that's where my mind immediately went to. A few of these were as small as cantaloupes, but not many. My thoughts were then interrupted by a loud splash beside me. I turned my light onto something huge, scaly, and appearing to scramble to its feet to reach a size of at least 3 or 4 heads taller than I. The eyes were large and copper-colored, and they were full and teeming of hate that I had never seen in an animal's eyes before. It looked like somebody had crossbred a professional wrestler with a dinosaur, and the sight, smell, and sound of the thing terrified me and electrified my nerves. This thing then turned and jumped into the water next to us. I had no idea what this was or what it was planning. I had never seen an animal or creature like this in my life, but me and my crew used this moment of advantage and bolted during the critical moment. We all told the same story, having witnessed the same thing, but all of us were suspended without payment. So, I feel like this is a perfect opportunity to really get this story out there, and I'm trying to remain anonymous, as to hopes it doesn't come back on me. But if more people can be mindful of the things that actually exist, and stop being so quick to write off things we don't really know about in our reality, I think we'd be a lot more prepared for the unknown. I was hunting alligators in an area that is probably illegal, so I'm just going to tell you that I was in a swamp where many crocs are, and that many people aren't. I guess I'm considered very skittish, so I choose to be up in hunting blinds as to guarantee that I have the element of surprise nearly every time. After all, I've never seen a croc once being able to properly climb a tree. Eventually, it did happen, and I saw movement down below, where it almost looked like a dead log was drifting along. It was a drifting log that had scales, so I knew I had found my catch. If you don't know what to look for, well, anything can be very convincing. I aimed for where the head was and fired. I smiled to myself and began to make my way down. If I had acted a second sooner, I would consider myself in serious trouble. The water sprayed as if a bomb had gone off. Some sort of lizard monster leapt out onto the grass, and it was giving every indication of being full of rage. The reason why, well, I just took a shot at it. There was a large wound in its right shoulder. The thing standing upright on 2 feet that had a large barrel-shaped body hinted at the fact clearly that it wasn't an average alligator. This thing was an abomination. Its back being slightly haunched. It's blasting me with ear-splitting shrieks, and it whipped around, looking at me. The snout had been longer, and it could have easily passed for a dinosaur. Except the dinosaurs don't act like this. It set its gaze on me, and then took a step toward, getting ready to attack. I didn't come down from my blind until I couldn't hold my nose any more than I needed to. I wasn't going to waste any more time, so I took several more shots at this thing. And in order to avoid my bullets, this thing dove back into the water and disappeared underneath. Where it went, I'm not exactly sure. But that never happened though. It never resurfaced. Has anybody else spotted lizards out here that can walk like this? Or are they just built like a wrestler? I've reached out to this sub because, well, I'm looking for answers. Part of me really wants to think that it was just a dream that I had all the while nodding off in a blind. But maybe I'm missing the rounds for my ammo. So I know that the encounter did happen. I have to be more afraid now than ever for the law looking out for illegal hunting. And it feels like I may never actually sleep peacefully again. So, I'm wanting to ask you guys, what the hell did I see? What did I encounter? Now, this story starts the day after I moved into my new home. I had just moved from my apartment, which was in a very bad neighborhood. Lots of bad things happening there. But that's another story. So, I had just moved into my new house, a small 2-bedroom house. The kitchen was right in front of the master bedroom, and the secondary bedroom was right off of the living room. I had my mother and 2 siblings living with me. They took the very large master, while I took the secondary bedroom. Anyways, this encounter took place pretty much late in the night, around 11. Everyone had gone to sleep, so I was pretty excited that I had the house all to myself. I decided that I would do dishes to help out my mother. Then, play some games on my Xbox for the rest of the night. I walked into the kitchen with my dog, started doing up the dishes. About halfway through them, I began feeling really uneasy. I started thinking that it was just an unexpected anxiety attack, which I get pretty often. So, I didn't really think much of it. I paused and decided that maybe a glass of water would help. While I was sipping my water, I started to hear my dog growling from the living room. I say my dog, but he is really my mother's dog. He is a very, very good guard dog, as in will destroy an intruder in a heartbeat type of guard dog. Anyways, so I heard him growling, a very low, quiet growl. Me being the stupid 17-year-old I am, decided I was going to go see what he was doing. I put down my glass, walked into the living room, where both my puppy and my mother's dog were standing by the front door, their nose in the crack of it. Tiptoeing my way to the door, I listened carefully. All I heard was a faint scratching noise. I just assumed it was a raccoon, or one of the stray cats that frequented our house because we could always leave cat food out for them. I took a peek out the front window, which is located right beside the door, and I didn't see anything. Just the dark yard and porch, illuminated softly by the glow of the streetlight in front of the house. So, I told the dogs to chill out before they woke the family up. After they settled down a bit, I went back to finish up the dishes and think about what games I was going to play. As I was washing a plate, I got that uneasy feeling again. The feeling in the pit of your stomach that just feels like something is very wrong. I tried brushing it off, but it was coming on so strongly. All of a sudden, I got the feeling as though somebody was behind me, staring at me, silently watching me. My uneasy feeling turned scared and then stressful. I was so uneasy that I had whispered to myself, "Something bad is going to happen," and the floor began rumbling as though somebody was running on it, running it behind me as my back was turned away from the entry to the kitchen. It rumbled hard. The pounding of the footsteps was so loud. I didn't know what to expect, put my hands over my ears to block out the sound. It ran up behind me, and it slammed me into the kitchen counter, leaving a large bruise on my stomach. As soon as it all started, it stopped. Nothing but silence in the small kitchen once again. While checking my stomach, I waited to see if anything else was going to happen, but nothing did. The room falling quiet once again. I started panicking, feeling so scared about what had just happened. Finally getting the courage to turn around. As I did, sighed in relief. My big-eyed pupper was sitting in the doorway, staring up at me. Walking over to her and hugging her, then hooking her up to her leash to take her out before I went to bed. At this point, it was around midnight. I was so scared and exhausted. I just decided that it was the sleep my body was desperately craving, but hadn't received, causing me to think something had happened, when it really did not. Though it doesn't explain the bruise forming on my stomach. I even said to my pupper, hard to believe that my mind could conjure up something so scary. She was hooked up, and we walked outside onto the porch. Normally, we have 4 baby stray cats that basically live out there, but they were nowhere in sight, so I assumed they took cover over at the neighbor's house. I walked little Pupper into the yard, a little ways away from the side of the house where the kitchen window was. Now, I wasn't in front of the kitchen window. I was at the front of the yard, but I could see the kitchen window from where I stood. Looking down and talking to my pup, telling her what a good girl she is and how beautiful she looked. You know, what all puppy mamas do. She looked up at me, wagged her tail in delight, but then her mood suddenly changed as she then snapped her neck to where the kitchen window was. When I say snapped, I mean she turned her head so fast, I thought for real she was going to break her neck. It startled me, so I naturally took a couple of steps backward, trying to calm down from the scare. I glanced over to where she was looking, just a small quick glance, and to my surprise, I actually saw something. I wasn't expecting to see anything, so I had to double take at the sight of this thing. We both sat and stared, trying to see what it was. It resembled a tall black silhouette, 8 feet tall, a very large chest. I remember the chest so well, because it stuck out so far, like scarily far. The figure looked thin in the face, but quite large in the rest of its body, and it was staring over the large hedge that was in front of our kitchen window. It was staring into the window, like it was waiting, silently, for someone or for something to move inside the house. I'm guessing my dog's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, because she let out a small woof at the creature. And as soon as she did this, the creature turned his head and stared at me with huge green glowing eyes. My heart sank. The way its eyes were reflecting the light made me instantly think that I was standing in front of a giant 7-foot tall animal. It was silent. No sound. No nothing. I was so focused on the creature that I had failed to realize that the night insects had gone silent as well. There was no noise, except for the static sound of energy coming from the city. I froze while my pupper started barking loudly and violently. What could this be? Am I seeing things? Is this real? I scooped my pup up in my arms, running inside the house, all the while feeling the same pounding and hearing the loud thudding footsteps as the previous encounter that took place an hour prior. I ran so fast that I almost tripped over my own feet. Darting indoors, basically tossing my pooch on the couch, locking the door as fast as I could. Leaning against the door, I listened for whatever it was that chased us in. I also held the door closed, thinking it would actually do something to protect us from that thing. All I could hear was the sound of my heavy breaths coming from running so fast. My dog's barking must have disturbed my family, because my mother came out of her room and saw me holding the door closed. She clearly saw I was distressed and wrapped her arms around me, telling me everything was okay, asking what had happened. I could not get out the story. For some reason, my mind told me not to tell her, because I knew that she would not believe me. So, I made up a story about how one of the neighbors startled me and assured her that I was okay. To this day, she still doesn't know. None of my family does, and I still don't know what that creature was. But I do know one thing: it will haunt my mind for a very long time. This happened to me and a few friends of mine during Halloween in 1999. We were all dressed up to hand out by my Elephant Mountain, a local name for a mountain, that we rode our bikes, then hiked to the top. We had dug a hole for a fire and cleared up the area for the fire. We did it a couple times that year. I mean, we were all 15 to 18, so it was fun. We were having time to relax and watching the skies after midterms. After around 8:30, we began to hear low screaming or moaning, non-sexual moaning that is, like somebody was hurt. So we took out our flashlights to look around, and we couldn't find anything. So we came back and found our camp was messed with. Our chairs were stacked unfolded, like a pyramid. We thought one of us did it, and no one confessed. But about 15 or 20 minutes later, we heard what sounded like a rejected Muppet Coyote. It didn't sound quite right. It's like somebody tried to make that sound without knowing what it truly sounded like. We decided to nope it out of there fast, and we drowned out the fire before we left. The following Monday, we were talking at our school, TA. She's Native American, although I don't remember which tribe. She heard us talking about it and held us after class and said be careful around that area. It was a stomping ground of evil spirits. She called her husband's friend to come bless us with sage and other herbs to make us all medicine bags for us. However, I don't think I'll ever want to deal with another skinwalker or evil spirits again. I was staying at a hotel in downtown Minneapolis. It was one of those single-story roach traps that everybody knows are a great idea to stay away from. But being desperate and broke, and staying on the road would have been a death sentence. So, I got checked in, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary upon first look. I remember looking out my window, and looking right into the window of another nearby hotel. I thought it was kind of strange that two businesses like that would be literally back to back. But then again, it's not unusual to see two different pharmacies on the same block, one of them deliberately building close to the other in hope to rival the business. Being too tired to even watch TV, I found myself drifting back to the window just to stare outside and look at the sky. Now, I don't know how long it had been since I'd been staring, But I swore I saw a large and exceptionally ugly dog looking at me. My sister has a Rottie that has even won contests for its size and weight, and I'm pretty sure that this animal that I was looking at was even larger. It even sniffed the glass as I could pick up my scent. I began looking around for a light source that must have been nearby for some reason for this animal's eyes to give off light the way it was. Similar to the eye shine that you get from any animal that walks in front of your headlights. Except I never recalled seeing eye shine in an animal that had yellow, honeyish amber eyes to it. It was disturbing. My puzzlement only increased when this creature began backing away from the window. I had imagined this whole time it was standing on its hind legs and leaning on the windowsill with its forelegs. But as it backed away slowly, it never fell down to the ground, as dogs normally would, and you'd expect them to, since they walk on all fours. The only way it could have stayed visible on that level was if it was clearly walking on two legs, like you or I. Now, with two walls between me and the thing, I wasn't exactly afraid, but there was this extreme unease that settled over me, and I couldn't shake it. I tried walking away from the window and watching TV, using the restroom, and even taking a shower. But I was always compelled to come back to the window, where my canine voyeur would be standing there waiting. And didn't its legs ever get tired? On several glances, I swear I caught the thing walking past the window, the same way that I was. Maybe I was getting the idea that it was toying with me. But what dog would be smart enough to do that far away, in such a complex housing arrangement? I considered reporting it, but I didn't even know which room the next door building was, and it wouldn't look good if I just went in and started snooping around. Safe to say, I did not sleep well that night. Days later, after I had just gotten on the road, I was looking up the news in Minneapolis, just in case somebody found a walking dog in a hotel. There was apparently a report of a homicide. One of the cleaning personnel was found dead, with wounds that looked like they had been inflicted by a supposed wild animal. In my mind, there couldn't be any mistaking it. Why they never saw the thing or caught up to it till then, I don't know. How it even got inside the building unnoticed, I'll never know. It's disturbing just knowing that these animals can walk among us, enter our daily lives and dwelling places, without ever being seen, has really, really disturbed me. Anyway, this happened about 15 years ago. This is my encounter with what I would call a Wolfman on a moving vehicle. I'm pretty much on call 24/7 for a towing company that is used heavily by a roadside assistance outfit. You know how it works. You pay a premium, and no matter where you are, you make a phone call, and a tow truck will come, even in the middle of the night. The person driving that tow truck is usually me. Needless to say, I don't smile much. I guess I'm not a huge people person, although I do enjoy getting people out of sticky situations when it comes to cars. Something happened to me, though, that has seriously made me consider a change of careers, even though I don't have much to work with for qualifications. I did receive a phone call about servicing a call that originated out on a remote highway next to a thick, vast pine forest near the mountains. Of course, it couldn't have just been a pine forest nearby, but it had to be up in the mountains. Anyway, I arrived at the GPS coordinates at about 1:15 till midnight. It was pretty dark and cold, since this was late fall, early winter. I found the vehicle, but I did not find the person that made the call. It was difficult to see in the flashing yellow lights of my tow truck. I dug out a heavy-duty flashlight and began shining it around. Well, I found the caller. It was a woman, sprawled out in the grass. I felt a tightness in my chest when I could see that she was covered in blood. I got back in my tow truck, locked the doors, and called 911 immediately. I was about to put my first call through when something enormous collided with my truck, making the windshield burst, nearly in cracks. Crouched on the hood of my truck, looking at me in the eye, was a horrendous-looking canine creature. I couldn't make out much else, but the face being so vivid and glowing eyes that its memory bore into my brain. It showed its teeth, acted extremely aggressive and hostile, and snarled at me. This was some sort of wolf, literally the size of a bear, and the killing power of a monster truck running over somebody. I know that's a bizarre description, but when you're in the moment of absolute fear, this thing could have ended my life in the snap of a finger. I started my truck and began to go as fast as I could. And if you've ever seen a tow truck, you know they aren't made to turn on a dime. I consider myself indescribably lucky that there were no other vehicles nearby. Had anybody been coming, there would have been a terrible accident. I made it back onto the road, but had terrible momentum, and I was fishtailing, scraping and bumping. At one point, this thing's head swung down and smashed into my driver's side window. After one sharp turn, it nearly overturned my vehicle. I saw the body of this thing tumbling across the road on the ground. After that, I took a leave of absence for as long as I legally could without losing my job. You can imagine I was interrogated by the police. Well, maybe interrogation is the wrong word. Questioned up and down is perhaps the right terminology. I didn't dare tell my employer, though, what I saw, and I only told the police what little I can tell them without being written off as insane. The case didn't really seem to make it on the news, and was probably just written off as a wild animal attack, potentially eaten by a bear. This happened just this last fall and winter, and to be honest with you, it's been an exercise keeping in straight and not having panic attacks. I've had to be put on night calls again. I mean, with COVID, I have to pay the bills. So, I don't have much of a choice. I don't have very many great credentials, and finding another job that pays as well as this one would be very difficult. Again, in COVID times, it seems impossible. But it's something I know I have to do, unless I want to die. But I fear that I'll have to go out again in the night, to another call, deserted in the middle of nowhere, and face this horrible monstrosity. I was stationed in Iraq during the presidency of Obama. I'm one of the fortunate few that had been assigned to a place where there wasn't much of action of any kind. But the only thing I had to worry about was keeping the sand out of my rifle. We were surrounded by a lot of wild desert, and if you know anything about the geography of the Middle East, well, I can tell you there's a lot of sand and a lot of hot temperatures. Based on what we had experienced before, it was only a matter of time before the enemy attacked us. This particular platoon spent our share of time in Gasling patrolling the rock-studded desert, where you hope to God you never get stranded. It was one evening, when the sun was about setting, and one of my fellow soldiers urged me to follow him. He said that he found something incredible. We were driving out into the desert when he told me that he was throwing some rocks into some of the caves, and he heard the sound of something shattering. He investigated. It was a long and narrow cavern. Our bodies lit up to a collection of earthenware that looked so ancient, I just thought of breathing on them would turn them to dust. My fellow soldiers supposed that they were worth something if they could be extracted, most of them being pots and jars, and they looked like they could be used to carry all sorts of liquids and other goods. There were a few oil lamps in the style of a civilization. I took a few moments to notice, but every last piece of pottery, for some inscription or decoration, seemed to be related to wolves. Where there were depictions of a full body, the animal appeared to be walking on two legs, not unlike Anubis from Egyptian mythology. I felt like I was at a crossroads between looking at Fenris from Norse mythology and Anubis. A few seconds later, I was looking at something else, and I have no idea where it came from or what it was, but it appeared to be blocking the exit to the cavern. It had to duck slightly to step inside. I couldn't see definitive features other than its outline and its eyes. But I kid you not, its eyes were lit up like a Hollywood effect. We turned our lights on, and I instantly wish we had not. Walking on its back legs, just as naturally as me and my fellow soldiers was walking on ours, was this monstrous creature that looked like some sort of beast mix between a dog and a man. It resembled a German shepherd and was a solid onyx black. I think that was the point where my fellow soldier soiled himself. He told me that's what he did once we got out of that mess. I'm probably foreshadowing the outcome of this story a little too much, but hear me out. We might not have survived if it weren't for the fact that we were packing heavy firepower. You don't realize how much of a punch that these firearms pack. Think of it. A standard human body is torn apart like a pulpy tomato. This animal was actually staggering backwards for what felt like forever. When it was actually 5 seconds before it went down, even after it hit the ground, it still appeared to be moving. I double-tapped the head to make sure that it wasn't going to give us any more trouble. We weren't sure what the bigger find was of the day. The cave, or the human half-monster dog thing. We dragged both back to base. We both figured that we were going to become some big figures. 2 American soldiers finding relics and a new species of animal. But the American government personnel did indeed come out and take both the body and relics. But nobody came for us. We kept a close eye on the news, and there was no report of any kind of the body we found. The world never found out about what happened, and nobody would give us an explanation why. Again, this all happened years ago, and unfortunately, since retiring from the military, I haven't exactly felt comfortable sharing this information. But if you think my story is a little far-fetched, well, let me tell you something else. I've had fellow soldiers who've also supposedly seen giants, just like described in the Bible, orange hair and everything. If you really don't know much about it, just simply research it. It's pretty crazy, but I will stand firmly with what me and my friends saw that day. Something I can never hope to describe or see in America. A few years back, my buddy and I went on a hunt. Neither of us were particularly looking forward to it. We didn't do this kind of thing for fun. In fact, the last time I'd even fired a gun had been in my teens, and that was an air rifle, and the targets were excitingly beer cans. However, my parents, living on an old farm, they didn't rely on it for income. They had some chickens and sheep, and something had been stealing and eating them. Time after time, they would come down in the morning to find a headless hen or mauled lamb, and neither of them were getting any younger, so to speak. My pops had an old rifle and had announced he was going to search for the coyote or wolf, or whatever was responsible for taking the animals, and clearly shoot it. Since Pop can't see too well, his hands are more shaky than jello. I didn't think that was a good idea. So, that was pretty much how my buddy Jim and I ended up out in the woods behind the farm, at night, looking for some wolf or coyote. The kind of thing only hits you when you actually come across what you're looking for. Right up until we actually saw the wolf. We felt like boys again. And the second I saw those yellow eyes, I nearly crapped myself. Because simply, have you ever actually seen a wolf? They are huge. At least this one was. In fact, it was the biggest animal I have ever laid my eyes on. It wasn't too far away either, and it appeared to be stalking us. circling around us. It was on all fours, as a wolf should be. But this is going to sound strange. It didn't look entirely natural, like it wasn't 100% comfortable in that position. You might be wondering why we didn't just shoot it. I mean, that was why we were there, right? Well, this animal was causing my parents distress, killing their animals. It could easily attack them, and right at that moment, us. We both had guns, but right then, we also both felt something we could only describe as very evil and wrong, almost as if something was compelling us not to shoot. And if you think that is the most scary or crazy part, then listen up. The damned thing stood up on two legs and just casually walked away, on 2 feet. We were too scared to shoot. Still, just standing there, guns pointed to the ground. We were entirely frozen, unable to pick it up and point it. After it had walked off, it was like a spell had been broken, and we just were left standing there, looking at each other in shock. I remember my friend saying, "Do you want to go after it?" and me giving him a big no. We didn't know exactly what we had just seen, or why we hadn't been able to move. But whatever that thing was, I can tell you now, I'm nearly confident it wasn't anything natural. I believe it was ungodly, and not of this world. However, the only good thing to come from it was that it never came back again, and surprisingly, left my parents and their animals alone. Whether we broke some sort of curse, and yes, I know that sounds wacko, but I guess we won't never know. I never told anybody about it, 'cause originally, who would believe me? Well, it wasn't until I got a little bit older that I befriended a Native American. I'm not trying to be racist here. I'm just saying. Somehow, through small talk, we got onto the discussion of this event that had happened, and he was surprised, told me I should have gotten blessed, and that I could have possibly been dealing with a skinwalker. Is this true? How accurate is he? Since I work as a delivery driver, it isn't unusual to see all types of wildlife, and sometimes run into weird stuff. I can drive for many miles, hours, sometimes days at a time. I've been doing this for almost 20 years. But the strangest thing that's ever happened was when I was delivering down in Arizona. Before I go on, I want to preface this that I've seen some really, really crazy things. For example, a naked meth head running across the road at 2 in the morning. If that doesn't make your skin spike up, I don't know what will. Anyway, the scenery in Arizona is beautiful, and to keep the boredom at bay, I try and spot as many different animals as I can, specific to an area, so I could then tell my kids about them when I get home. So, when I was headed down this long, stereotypical dusty desert road, nothing on either side for as far as the eye could see, I was pleasantly surprised when this animal that looked kind of like a coyote suddenly seemed to appear out of nowhere. It appeared to be running alongside the truck, like a pup might be chasing its owner. It must have been real fit, 'cause it followed me for several miles, never once losing speed. I began to feel a little unnerved by it. I couldn't have told you why exactly, but something was gnawing at me internally. I didn't know too much about desert animals, coyotes especially, but it didn't seem normal that one could keep up with a vehicle for so long. So, I put my foot down and increased my speed. It stayed there, keeping pace, right outside the driver window. I put my foot to the floor, running the truck ragged. We must have hit 70 miles an hour, and that dang coyote was still there. I knew something weren't right. This creature wasn't right. Then, all of a sudden, It stopped. It was no longer following, and as I looked back in my mirror, through the trail of dust behind me, there wasn't a single coyote sat behind me in the road. It was a man. So I kept my foot on that pedal and didn't look back for a long time. He never seemed to reappear in man or coyote form, but I won't ever forget that. Turns out, people believe I saw a skinwalker or some sort of native shapeshifter. I'm not sure I believe it. I am active and part of a search and rescue volunteer team. We get to help out the police when someone goes missing and they need a lot of ground covered. We have found vital bits of evidence over the years, although thankfully, never an actual body. It does often involve us going deep into woods, as you might expect, which was where I saw this buck. Now, I have seen plenty of deer over the years. It's not unusual at all, and they have never caused me harm or threat. They usually just run away, as deer do, even the bucks. But this one was huge. Definitely an older male with huge antlers. Probably a 5-pointer. But it didn't run as soon as I saw it, or as soon as it saw me, which was strange. At first, I almost wondered if it might be hurt, too injured to get away. But I couldn't see anything. It wasn't acting injured if it was. Or if it was injured, it wasn't exactly obvious. Other than its apparent bravery or stupidity, there was just something so off-putting about the entire thing. Upon first glance, I couldn't place what it was. I was kind of in awe being that close to it, and it would have been a wonderful moment if there wasn't that overpowering sense of something just not being quite right. It just stared at me, and that was when I realized it was its eyes. They were human. A pair of human eyes staring back at me from this large, unafraid buck. Now keep in mind, bucks are big, yes, but there's a certain size that they get up to, and this buck was just far too big to be an average buck. I've seen adult elks out in the wild, and they're massive. This buck easily rivaled that. It just continued to stare at me when the radio I had for communication came through with a message. Somebody had found bones. I looked up, and this buck was gone. No trace, as if it had never been there in the first place. Turns out, the bones were very old, and apparently belonged to an old tribe. I'm curious, and I'm coming to you for this. Was there spirit in that deer? Or was this a skinwalker protecting the land? Possibly the spirit of an animal. It was scary, but it could have gone a lot worse. I'm just relieved as hell that I got called away, and never had the chance to find out for sure. This is among the many creepy things we encounter and deal with out in the wild. I'll never quite forget it. My husband and I grew up on a res. He has gotten the chance to tell me all sorts of amazing stories about legends and traditions of his ancestors. I always find them fascinating, even though to me, not having grown up with them, they just sound like entertaining stories. I mean, there's no way these things could possibly be real. At least I thought that for a while. Until we spent a week on the res last summer. We've stayed there dozens of times with various family members and friends before, but I have never experienced anything out of the ordinary until then. Even though we do not share the same heritage, I am always respectful to my in-laws. My husband might know that I enjoy but don't believe the stories. I would never openly admit that to the elders. My husband is also fairly distinctive. After getting ill a couple of years ago. He lost all his hair, so although he is only in his 30s, he is completely bald. When I saw him that week, coming out of the diner, when he had left him at the house not 10 minutes prior, I was rather bemused. I had the car. He was at home. Not only was he at home, well, his parents' home, he hadn't slept too well, and was sat up in bed, with a coffee still in his PJs when I left, only in the car to get a few supplies from the store. This man, who exited the diner, looked the exact image of my husband, but was in jeans and a work jacket. By the time I looked back in the mirror, he was gone entirely. I even pulled over and called my husband. It took him a moment or two to answer, since his cell was in his pocket of his pants, which at the time were folded on the chair, in the bedroom, where he still was. I saw the man who looked identical twice more during that same week. Each time my husband not being with me, but somewhere very different to where I saw the look-alike. Each time, by the time I was able to stop, he had disappeared. There is not one other male on the res anywhere near his age with a bald head. Of course, other people have come in and out. Other members of people's families, friends, deliveries, etc. But in a community as small as this, everybody knows everybody, and everything that is going on. During the time I was seeing my not husband, my actual husband continued to have problems sleeping, which he has nearly never suffered from. He was starting to feel really unwell. And that was when my in-laws brought in the medicine man. I wasn't exactly privy to the exact ritual, and I won't tell you anything I did see, because it is a sacred and special tradition. Whilst the man was with my husband and father-in-law, I sat in the kitchen with his mother, drinking tea, and she told me that the doppelganger I had been seeing in fact was a skinwalker, which was why my husband was sleeping and feeling so ill. The skinwalker was draining his life force, his very energy. They had to act and get rid of the curse. Otherwise, the skinwalker, apparently, could begin to control whoever they are copying. It was terrifying, and if I hadn't seen the man who looked identical to him, I would have never believed it. The ceremony took a long time, and apparently, the spell had been strong. We will never know why my husband was chosen. Thankfully, it appeared to work, and I insisted on driving around the res as he got rested. Thank God I didn't see the man who looked like him again. Hopefully, that is my only and last encounter with one of these beings. I was riding my bike along a paved trail here in Montana, a downhill one, no less. It was walled in by pines, and the scent of cold air against my face was literally intoxicating. I can only describe it somewhat accurately, because if you're not a bike rider, well, it's hard to explain. This was the healthiest I'd ever felt when I was on the trail. Fresh air is like a drug. But the polarity of everything changed one evening when I was out for another ride, trying to get my fix before I had to call it a day to start another grueling work week. You see, bike rides have always been a huge thing for me. In fact, it's really my only escape. While others turn to alcohol, drugs, and very toxic habits, I try and do things that boost my body. So, I was coasting down the trail when a black bear appeared out of nowhere and even began running alongside me. I nearly wiped out, unsure of what to do at the bizarrety of the situation. If it wanted to, it could have pounced on me, but it didn't even look at me. It seemed to be focused on the downhill descent as much as I had been. I pedaled and pedaled to gain distance. That was when another shape came out of the trees that was much, much larger than the bear. It tackled the bear to the ground, with a force unlike anything I'd ever seen. No, I was not drunk on adrenaline. In this moment, I thought that I saw whatever attacked the bear looked like the largest wolf I'd ever seen. I'm talking about a creature of titanic size. It grabbed the bear, yanked it by the neck, and stood up on its hind legs. The bear seemed to be yelping and grasping for life. It was terrifying. I watched this all from the shock of being on my bike, which meant I literally wasn't watching where I was going. I slid off the trail, wiped out, and eventually lost consciousness. I woke up. The picture of that monstrous wolf kept flashing in the back of my mind. That thing grabbed that black bear like it was a loose cub running away. It terrified me. I didn't know why it didn't go after me. I've tried going back on that trail since, but it's not the same anymore. I don't feel like I can relax like I used to. The anxiety of what might jump out of the woods overshadows all else. And much to my dismay, it's the same with the other trails. I'll never be able to experience the outdoors the same way again, unfortunately. Thanks for hearing me out. We lived on a big property when I was younger, and my mom is obsessed with rabbits. Sometimes, some of the local animals come to pay a visit, and although they cannot get to the rabbits, because they only have little hearts, they get scared to death. Literally, rabbits can have a heart attack and die right of fear. Anyway, my dad decided to set up some traps. Whatever was getting in was managing to climb the fence, so he was hoping the traps laid out would work. I have no idea what they thought the culprit might be. Some deranged bunny killer animal, maybe. Anyway, even though my mom loves her rabbits, she decided it was too gross to have to go and check the traps. She offered me an extra allowance if I went. So, every morning I checked, and there was nothing. All the bunnies were fine. They began to suspect that whatever was bothering them somehow was intelligent enough to see the traps and run away. Coyotes, maybe? Not sure. That is until one night, I heard this howl, followed by what sounded like a scream. I wasn't going out there to check, but I was willing to bet there would be some sort of wolf or coyote in the trap in the morning. It was the only thing I could think of that would make that sort of noise. I told my mom that I'd heard something, and she insisted I take the shotgun with me in case. Now, you're probably wondering where my dad is in all of this. Overseas is the answer. I'm a military brat, so I also know my way around a shotgun. I head out to the trap and I knew it. There was something in it. It looked like a coyote, but much bigger. And there was something not quite right, but I couldn't decide what it is. I should have just shot it right then and there, right in the head. But I was entranced in fear and curiosity. This large, not quite a coyote. It was alive. Its back leg was caught in the trap. It was bleeding bad, but it wasn't showing any bone, so the trap had acted more like a handcuff, so to speak, a very tight one, keeping it there, rather than like a bear trap, where it rips deep into the skin. Every single bit of common sense told me this was the douche that had been upsetting my mother by scaring her rabbits. That's all I needed to do was shoot it, like I had done to other animals. But I had this innate feeling in me that was telling me not to do it. I decided to take a quick walk around the full perimeter. Maybe I was trying to gear myself up for the inevitable. And then, when I get back to the trap, it was completely empty. Quickly, I scan the fields and woodland around, and just in the distance, I can see that large coyote limping, but walking on two legs. Walking or limping on 2 feet like an injured person who had been shot in the leg. I stood there staring at it until it disappeared into those woods. I told my mom that I had found a dead coyote and that I'd buried it, even though it was a lie. She believed me, and her rabbits after that were unbothered. That coyote thing that walked like a man never came back. That memory always sticks out to me, because as bizarre as the wild is, I've never quite encountered or heard of anything like that since then. I was out fishing with my father. He was older and his sight was going, but he still had a love for going out on the lake. I knew better than to pass up any chance to be with my dad at this stage in his life. We pushed out onto a quiet lake and passed the time in quiet and hushed conversation. I did catch a few catfish within the first couple hours, and they were just the right size. It was the catch my dad got that would have us talking for a long time. It crested the waters a couple of times, and it was a bass that looked like it could have fed the two of us for 3 days. A real beauty of a catch. My dad wasn't able to reel it on his own, so I helped out in whatever awkward, giddy way I could. We were winning, though, amongst the splashes getting closer, and as most fish stories go, the line snapped at the last minute. But this was strangely accompanied by a very large splash that even a very large fish could not make. We were just as puzzled as we were disappointed. My dad doesn't like to go cheap when it comes to fishing equipment. There's no go reason why that fish should have been able to snap the line. We gazed around at the shore and contemplated going landside for a while with our fish. Our thoughts were then interrupted when something huge emerged from the water, anchoring the wriggling fish in place with its long hand. It struck me as a gigantic dog, but it was walking on its hind legs, almost naturally, as if that were the very thing it had been doing since birth. It shook itself and continued on swimming. The mustiness and the smell of wet dog drifted across the water to us, and there it sat on shore, on its haunches, and tore into this fish. It slowly leered over at us more than once, and the eyes, I swear, were glowing, like a cat's eyes when the light catches them just right. My dad and I should have panicked and gotten out of there, but we were so shocked. We just laid there, low in the boat, watching this overgrown demon dog guzzle down his prized catch. The teeth tore into this fish like soft ice cream. They were long fangs, ridiculously oversized. Its ears were also long and curved, giving the impression of almost sleek black horns. When it had picked off every last bit of meat within seconds, it appeared to lick its hands quickly and bound off inland out of our sight. My dad and I just looked at each other, complete disbelief. We wore the same expression. We both had seen how unbelievable that fish had been. We both had seen how unbelievable that wolf monster had been. And we both knew that no matter what or whoever we told, nobody was going to ever take us seriously. I discovered your podcast about a month later, and I told my father about it. He figured it was a good place to tell our tale, as any. So, I'm telling you what is probably the most outlandish story of the one that got away, unlike you've ever heard. I'll make sure my dad hears it if you read it. I've been enjoying listening to your program ever since I discovered it. It feels like a safe place to share these stories without ever being judged or being ridiculed. Keep up the good work. And as a quick side note before I conclude, I was beginning to really think that werewolves were real until I discovered there was such an animal called a Dogman, that I believe that is what we saw that day. Anyway, thank you. Sometimes, when you're in the car and you have to go on a long drive and it's nighttime, when you have to go, you have to go. If there isn't an official service station around, and it's a dark country road, and nobody else is around anyway, especially if you are a bloke, you can do this. I'm not proud, but needs must. And this happened just weeks ago. I was busting, and it was at least about 30 minutes home, and I was not going to make it. So, since I haven't seen another car for miles, and I'm in the middle of bloody nowhere, I pull over and keep the engine running and the lights on to give me a bit of sight, since it is pitch black. I'm finishing up when I begin to hear a crunching sound from the tree line behind me. It made me jump enough to get my shoes a bit wet, which was bad enough. But I also recall thinking, really, a nosy badger or something like that had come to see what was happening right at that moment. I was still tidying myself up when I now hear a further noise. This time it was a good thing that I had already relieved myself. I heard a growl. I am no expert at all on nocturnal animal behavior, but I was now pretty certain this was not a badger. For just a moment, I was frozen, my brain telling me to get in the car. My legs were just, let's play stick in the mud. And then he appeared, just walked out of the tree line and onto the grass in front. At very first glance, I panicked. I thought it was a werewolf in the flesh, and I was a goner. But I was alive, and I looked again. It looked more like a dog. I know it sounds ludicrous, but it was a man's body with a dog's head. Vicious looking, but more human than werewolf-like. Tall, covered with very dark hair, and also very slender. Then he growled at me again. My legs almost became unglued, and I piled myself back in the car and drove out of there quickly. For some reason, even though this creature appeared hostile, it never made an attempt at me or my life, or to get me in my car. It's like it respected the fact that I got in my car and drove off. Maybe it was trying to scare me away this entire time. I'm just glad it didn't appear to follow me, but I sure as hell did not look back or stop until I get home. For reference, I have done a ton of research after I had a very strange encounter whilst camping this one time, but I can't find anything like what I saw. Similar, but not the same. So I wonder if anybody listening to this might be able to help me. A few months back, I went on a camping trip with some good, close buddies of mine. Nothing too crazy, just some basic fresh air good times. On the second night, I woke up to use the bathroom. Since the bathroom block was a short walk away, and not only was it dark, it was also pouring down rain, I threw on a jacket and headed over to the trees. Since I didn't want to pee where you would likely be stepping later, even with the rain, I used my flashlight and headed just a bit further into the trees. We were also camping with some girls, and it just didn't feel right exposing myself so close to them. Just as I'd finished, I heard some rustling nearby, as it was your stereotypical dark and stormy night. I was in the middle of a wood, surrounded by all sorts of animals. After all, I wasn't exactly shocked to hear it, but at the same time, I didn't want to meet a squirrel with my pants down. Then, and I will swear this happened, I heard my name being called, but not from the direction of the tents, in front of me, in the trees. Now that freaked me out for sure, but my mind told me the most logical explanation was one of the others had also woken up and was messing with me. I called out, but not too loudly, and then it stepped out into my flash. It was taller than you'd expect an animal to be, but way shorter than I, so around 4 feet or so. It was covered in white hair or fur. It had legs similar to a goat, with cloven feet. but regular human-like arms that was also covered in thick, dark fur. The hands resembled that of a person. The head, I guess, was a bit like a goat, or maybe a deer. It was really strange looking, and it had these big wide eyes. The thing had antlers on it too, but not huge. It just stood on 2 legs. And then this is the weirdest part, as if all this isn't weird enough. This thing had one more shocker to it. It spread its wings and rose up into the air, and I stood there in shock, staring at it, as it called my name again. But its mouth didn't move. It was almost like it was telepathic. And then in the blink of an eye, it disappeared. I just wandered off back to the tent, in a daze, in shock. I didn't sleep a wink, and as soon as it got light, I went back to that spot in the trees. In fact, part of me was sure I must have been sleepwalking, that it was some crazy dream. Just as I got to the tree that I had urinated on, I saw it. Some black hair on the ground. It was real. But all the stuff and weird stories I've ever found, there's been nothing like this. Oh, and by the way, this happened in Central Oregon, just for reference. I will never forget this thing that I saw once when I was out horseback riding. In the UK, we have plenty of brittle tracks which are specifically for horse to cut out some of the roads. I use these as often as possible when I can avoid all traffic, as it tends to spook my mare. Sometimes we do go off paths and do a little bit of exploring. Nothing too rough on our legs and feet, but there is plenty of beauty to discover in the English countryside. There is also plenty of oddities as well as dangers. And although I consider myself an experienced writer and map reader, sometimes you can get a little lost by accident, which was what happened that day. I would have never taken the path so close to the caves and grottos down by the river by choice, but somehow, that was where we ended up. Traffic spooks her, as I said, but not much else. So I was more mindful of keeping away from the rocky areas and banks by the river, because of her shoes than her being worried. As I was trying to work out a safe way to get us back up onto the road, I noticed sudden movement in one of the caverns. Now, being an animal person and living in the UK, there aren't too many animals to be wary of, especially when you're on the safety of horseback. I wasn't exactly afraid, not to start with at least. I was curious though, what could be in there? We don't have bears, and most of our forest life is in trees or burrows. I wish now that we had just kept on walking and ignored it, because the thing that appeared in the cave opening was like nothing I have ever seen before or hope to ever see again. It was tall and thin, almost skeleton-like. It was a very strange color, like dirt. But then I suppose it could have literally been covered in dirt and filth. It had an almost human-like body, and for just a moment, I thought that it could have been a person who had been trapped in there, potentially starving, hence the very bony appearance and filthy skin. But there was no presuming it was a human once, because the head became fully visible. I tried my best in that moment not to scream, or to startle or scare my horse. The last thing I wanted was to be thrown off and left with this thing. The head. The only way I can describe it was that it was like a bird, and there was utterly no way it could be any kind of mask. It was far too realistic, especially the way the mouth or beak opened up, and the eyes were strange too, pale and cloudy, as if it were blind. This thing, whatever it was hideous, and it appeared to have something dripping out of its mouth. And that's when I noticed part of a rabbit in its hands. It was eating on a dead rabbit. This grotesque bird, on an emaciated humanoid body. I just suddenly came to my senses, and we cantered off. I'm ashamed to say I was less concerned about my horse's hooves, and more for our lives. I haven't got a damn clue what that thing was, but there's a reason not to go messing around near caves. We wandered off, and this thing kept a close eye on us the entire way, until we were no longer visible. Luckily, it never made an attempt to leave the cave to come after us, nor did I ever feel like it wanted to. Perhaps it was just curious by our appearance. I'm not sure. Either way, it's by far one of the strangest things I've ever seen in my life. Sometimes, you see the weirdest stuff in the most regular of circumstances. Like this one time, I was literally just walking home from watching a game at my friend's house. It wasn't totally dark, but it was getting there. It's a fairly built-up area though, and I'm a dude in my 30s, so I wasn't exactly worried. However, I ain't dumb either. So when I began to get the feeling that somebody might be following me, I quickly picked up my pace. It was that kind of feeling you get when you know somebody is staring at you, when you can feel their eyes all over you. There were plenty of houses about, and cars traveling up and down the street. I figured it was unlikely that I'd get jumped with a ton of potential witnesses. I stopped near a parked car, where a couple were just getting out, and heading back into their home, pretending to check my phone, and actually looking behind me to see if I could see anybody. But there was nobody. Figuring I must have been mistaken, I carried on walking. I still had that feeling of being watched, even though it felt like I was just being paranoid. I kept checking behind me, but there was nobody there. No shadowy figures, no meth heads, nothing. It made me feel really uncomfortable, if I had to say, and I would admit that there was something that just felt wrong. Foreboding, may I say, but there was no reason for it. Nobody was there. I must be losing it, I remembered thinking. There was nothing behind me. Then came the horror movie moment. As I turned looking in the direction to see if somebody was following behind me, I heard movement right in front of me. Of course, wouldn't you know it? It had to happen on the stretch in between the blocks of houses, where the parks and greenery is for people to walk their dogs and kids to play. I turned around very slowly, ready to use my charm to talk this dude down, or use some of that X-line backer strength I still had. Maybe expected to find some skinny kid in a hoodie. What I would have not have guessed in a million years was the boogeyman. Standing there, on the grass near the play park, was the biggest, blackest, nastiest looking thing I've ever seen. Its entire body was like oil, and when I say oil, I mean almost a translucent, liquidy black. I couldn't make out any features on the face, except two brightly glowing white eyes. It seemed alive. As I said, I played high school and football in college. I'm a pretty big guy, but this could have wiped me out. It was built real stocky, like a large slab of muscle. It was very devilish, and it instantly gave me a terrible feeling in my entire core. Then, I began to hear a low, rumbling noise. This thing was growling. I nearly fell to my knees in terror, and this thing approached me slowly, and then just appeared to dissipate into thin air, as if it was never there. I've questioned my sanity and my vision since this, wondering if I've had schizophrenic hallucinations, or if I'm just losing it. Either way, it was completely terrifying, and I cannot shake the feeling I had prior to this encounter, since it lasted for quite some time. That same feeling up until I saw it with my very own eyes. Except when I saw it, the feelings were intensified. I truly believe I saw some sort of monster from hell stalking me. Why and what its purpose was, I'll never know exactly for sure. Could it have been a messenger? I don't know. Or potentially, like the Native Americans believe, showing itself, revealing itself to be a bad omen of things to come. I don't want to know, nor do I want to find out. I never want to see that horrible thing again. Hiking, camping, and hunting are some of my very favorite things to do. I've had some pretty crazy experiences with animals, not behaving like they're supposed to. I've been chased by creatures that are supposedly meant to be docile, and even had a mountain lion walk straight past me. But the story I tell over and over is the time that I saw what I truly believe to be a Sasquatch. I was down in Utah and trying out some ultimate survival skills in order to run a course back home. I feel confident that I'm tough and can deal with most things you might experience out in the wild, and know the places to stay the hell away from. I might be a survivalist, but I'm not going to intentionally put myself in the path of a mama bear or a hungry pack of wolves, even with my gun. So I don't go looking for trouble necessarily. I just teach how to survive if trouble finds you. And that day, I truly believe if I hadn't had my wits about me, I would have been Sasquatch dinner for sure. I was nearing the end of the session down there anyway, when I took a deep hike. I had my gun holstered on my belt, just in case. There was just wading through the undergrowth when I am hit by the most god-awful smell. It was terrible. I probably ain't no daisy myself, but this was terrible. Like 1,000 skunks had all set off their stink, and then died. You get the picture. I'm thinking, I'm about to come across some rotting corpses, like a maggot-infested deer, or something, but I can't spot anything on the ground. Then, the trees start shaking, and I could hear this noise. It was like a boom. There's either going to be an earthquake, or something massive is coming through the trees. Then I see it. It doesn't come too close, leaving itself some room, but it is massive and partially hidden by the trees. But I could see this huge mass of what looked to be a body, very resembling of a bear or a gorilla. Then, something hit me. I look down, and it's a small rock. The more hit me, and I see this huge creature is pummeling me with rocks in my direction. And that was when I made the connection. Disgusting smells, huge footsteps, and a large body. Now the stones being thrown at me. I've only ever heard of these kinds of things through tales. There's no doubting this was indeed a Bigfoot. Could I have possibly stumbled across its territory or gotten too close to its home? Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to investigate further, as it started throwing bigger and bigger rocks, and one nearly caught me in the face. I thought I'd get the hell out of there before it killed me. Interestingly enough, this being, whatever it was, assuming it was a Bigfoot, could have easily killed me while throwing rocks at me. But it wasn't. It was intentionally missing me, throwing small rocks, as if trying to get my attention to beat it. I truly wonder if it really wanted me out of there. And maybe, just maybe, it smelt me first, which is why it was drawn to me. One thing I know for sure now is that Bigfoots are real. When I was just a kid, we had a couple of cousins that lived way out in the countryside. They were full-on proper hillbillies, that was for sure, but with hearts of gold, and I loved visiting them. We'd play for hours out in the woods back then, and we were actually allowed to be out all day, or until our bellies rumbled for food. The woods were likely full of all sorts of dangerous stuff, but they were the kind of people that you thought you had to learn from your own mistakes, and to not coddle the kids. It was great. Tree climbing, den building, swinging across the river. We'd come home covered in filth and bruises, and my aunt would always just say, "Did you guys have fun?" We'd always tell them we did. So, The day we came running back to the house after having been only out for a couple of hours, tears streaking down our faces and more than down my youngest cousin's leg. They knew something must have happened. We told them that we were playing far in the woods, down by the old creek and the tire swing, and all of a sudden, we smelled this terrible smell. And the first thing we did was blame each other, but it was 100 times worse than even a fart could be. A rustling noise and brush. We turned, and we saw it. Some sort of half-man, half-gorilla watching us. It made us scream. This thing was huge, and it was looking at us high up in the trees. Its face was kind of like a monkey. It was really tall, and covered in dark reddish hair. It opened its mouth and roared, and we all saw just how massive its teeth were. We ran. We were then told by my uncle, he and my older cousin Dale had grabbed their guns and headed back to that exact spot. When they came back, they hadn't found a thing, but the smell, that god-awful stench, lingered, and there was also some footprints, is what appeared. I swear, my uncle looked like he'd actually seen a ghost. Pale. He said the footprints were huge, much larger than any of their shoe size, and my uncle is practically a size 13-14. He told us boys that we weren't allowed to go back, ever. In his opinion, we had seen ourselves a squatch. This story takes place when my grandfather was still very much alive. He was the kind of man that spent literally every waking hour of his life working as a rancher, squeezing every dime out of every last second of his time. It paid off. He was able to retire quite handsomely and get a comfortable house in the middle of 17 acres of forest. If that doesn't sound isolated, well, it was. He never did like people, and I was kind of lucky that he liked me. He was every bit of the old man stereotype that shakes his fist and tells people to go away. More often than not, when he wanted to spend time with me, I ended up being his bouncer. Any stray sounds in the woods surrounding his home was an intruder, and I had to be the one to go on and tell them to get off. It always ended up being a squirrel, or a falling branch, or some other ridiculous benign non-human cause. He was kind of psychotic, so I guess you could assume that by this point. But that didn't dissuade him one bit. If he heard it, he had to attack it. His successful retirement hadn't upgraded his diet by much. He still had me over for some stew right out of the can. And when we were eating, we had heard a sound that was on the level of thunder, only it wasn't coming from the sky. It couldn't have been. The skies being perfectly clear. I can vividly remember his face getting red and telling me to go chase the kids off his land. I believe that there was something to this time, because whatever that sound was, it was deafening. I was pretty apprehensive in going out to take care of this problem. All I had was a revolver that he had gifted me when I was 16. It was better than nothing, but still. I entered a clearing in the woods where I found the source of the clamor. I could scarcely believe my eyes, and it was kind of a miracle that I didn't mess myself on the spot. Nothing in all my years could have prepped me for what I saw. Ever heard of a Bigfoot? I mean, who hasn't by now? But have you ever heard of a snowy white albino Bigfoot? Maybe that's a little new, at least for me. Heard of a snowy white Bigfoot having a violent encounter with other wildlife? It might sound like something out of a novel, but that's what I was seeing. This thing was huge, like you'd expect, and for some reason, a group of timberwolves had decided to pick a fight, and this big white Bigfoot, assuming that's what it was, grabbed one wolf and tore it in half like it was nothing. The other one was grabbed and nearly choked to death. It was terrifying. I was horrified. But they weren't discouraged, and they kept attacking. Then, this thing grabbed a third wolf, and grabbed it by the legs, and slammed it up against the tree, nearly breaking its back, as if it were a dead rabbit. I ran, for fear of my own life and safety. Then, I had to tell my grandfather that there was this thing, a Bigfoot, wrecking several timber wolves. He reacted about the way you'd expect. His eyes got wide, and he waited for me to tell him more. But he might not have believed me right then and there. He called me a few years later to tell me that he saw a Bigfoot, a white one that I told him about before. I know there are more terrifying things than a Bigfoot, but the entire experience and visual of it all left me with a sense of smallness. If wolves are nothing more than field mice in the eyes of some things on Earth, then what are mere men? I guess I shouldn't be so shaken up over seeing things in this new perspective, but I'd spent my life seeing men in a place in the universe that they apparently didn't really occupy. It's really done something to me. It's changed me, and not in a good way. This is hands down one of the scariest encounters I've ever seen in my life, and it tells me that we are definitely not on top of the food chain anymore. While I was growing up, my best friend was a border collie. We named her Cindy. Cindy was as wild as you would expect the breed to be. And if you know anything about border collies, well, it shouldn't be a surprise. She was the usual black and white. And even though we didn't have any sheep, since they're amazing sheep-herding dogs, she behaved every bit like a sheepdog toward me. I was the livestock that she had to keep corralled. So it was something of a game between her and I to just see how far I could get before her instincts kick in, and she had to come collect me, or whatever it was she was doing in her brain. At the time, we lived at the edge of an expansive pine forest deep in Nebraska. There was no shortage of timber for us to roam around in. For obvious reasons, my parents preferred that I did not go into the woods by myself. I mean, I was only 7 at the time. But as any parent of a child of 7 years of age, children exist only to push whatever boundary is in front of them, much to the dismay of creatures like parents and even sheepdogs. If you're hearing this story on a certain Cryptid Encounter podcast, then you know I have a story for you that didn't end well. It was one of those getaways that should not have happened. My parents were not around. Their friends were around, and so was Cindy. Plus, they had sternly charged me not to run off into the woods. So, with that many sets of eyes, I shouldn't have been able to get away undetected. Somehow I did. As soon as I sensed a window of opportunity, I booked it to see how far I could get before Cindy came looking. I had already long forgotten about the adults. I got a pretty good head start, and then I began to get lost. No adults and no dog came looking. I lost my bearings, and I couldn't find my way back at the time. So, I entered into a very small clearing, where there was a small pond. I was enchanted to the point that I forgot about getting back. Something moved in the shadows of the trees, and that's when I was confronted by the biggest living thing I had ever seen or known in my life. It resembled a monkey, but was very man-like in appearance. I guess I used to call it a mountain monkey, if that makes sense. I wasn't entirely sure if I should be afraid or fascinated. The thing's face was a mixture of curiosity and puzzlement, and yet I could tell it seemed to be devoid of any friendliness. Just as it was reaching one hand, Cindy appeared, and she put herself between me and this giant monkey thing, and began barking like crazy, her hackles raised and her teeth bared. This only fascinated this creature even more, or this monster, whatever it was. The creature just reached out toward its hand and tried to grab onto Cindy. But that's when I was truly terrified, because it somehow grabbed her and then choked her to death. And when I mean choked her, I don't mean in a traditional sense. It literally grabbed her and crushed her like she was a Coke can. That's when I panicked and fled, crying hysterically, screaming. I slammed into my father, who was completely livid. He wasn't sure if he should be happy to see me or be full of rage. After everything calmed down, the question was naturally raised as to the whereabouts of Cindy. At 7 years of age, I tried to tell them as best I could, with my very limited vocabulary, that this giant monkey man killed her. But they wouldn't understand what I meant for a very long time. A lot of people say they have had a hard time shooting Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Whatever, when they see it, because it just looks far too human. I have a feeling that if I ever encountered it again, and I'm armed, I would have zero problems taking revenge and taking a shot right between the eyes. The sound of my dog struggling for its life while it was being crushed alive is now this vivid traumatic memory in my mind and will forever be. My parents, however, at the time were convinced I saw a bear that killed Cindy. How wrong they were. This encounter took place when I was 14, and I had made friends with a fellow gun nut in school. He invited me over to his house to show me his parents' collection of rifles. Eventually, I would have him over to see my own dad's collection, but I think they were having much more firepower than my family was. It was when we were driving by a rather bare patch of land, I spotted a very attractive girl. She stopped me in mid-sentence, and even though we were cruising, she looked right back at me. I didn't say anything since we were with my friend's parents. I didn't want them to think that I'd turned their son girl crazy. We'd reached their home that sat at the edge of town, and it had a clear view of the Arizona rurals. Then, we started looking through his parents' guns, and I began looking around the room. Hanging on the wall was the picture of the girl that I had saw while we were in the car. It was unmistakable. The exact girl. The eyes, mouth, hair, especially the eyes, were all the same. I almost yelped. If she was family, I was hoping that I would have the chance to meet her. I kept quiet until I could talk to my friend in private. When later on, we were poking around his backyard, I brought up the girl that I had seen and how she happened to look like the one in the pictures that he had hanging up on his wall. He met my sentence with a very confused look, but then relaxation. He made sure of exactly where and when I had seen the girl. I told him. It was enthusiasm that he didn't share. He was about to run to get his parents when he paused and thought better of it. He actually went and made sure his parents were distracted. They were both busy watching TV. He had me follow him. We began walking down the road when he pointed to a spot in the distance and asked me if that was where I had seen the girl. I nodded. How had he known? We turned off the road and began huffing through unmarked grassland until we came to a small, rundown shed. Almost a hut that had a strong box hidden underneath the floorboards. Right in front of me, my friend showed me a rifle with a scope. My pulse, I could feel, was quickening. I was confused and asked him what he was doing. He told me that his sister had gone missing one night nearly 2 years ago. She was 13 at the time. He was 12. They shared a bedroom, and she had woken up, thinking she had heard the voice of her dead grandfather coming from outside. She was ecstatic and rushed outside and was gone in an instant, vanished without a trace. From where we stood, I could see the girl coming towards us in the distance. I asked him if that was his sister, but he refused to answer me. He was almost in a trance. Before I could do or say anything, he trained the rifle and fired. I was horrified as the shot landed and the girl fell to the ground. But then there she was again. Then there were two of her. My friend shot at both of them when his sister stopped appearing. He looked at me with a very sad expression. He told me that his parents wouldn't tell him exactly what they were, except that they always occupied the appearance and voice of the last person they supposedly killed. And they liked to hang around in burial places. The plot of land where I first saw her was a cemetery that had been in my friend's family for generations. They don't move on the house often, but when they did, they always looked like his sister when she was 13. She would have been 15 at the time, if she were still alive. I wondered why he was being so open with me. Maybe he felt alien with all the weirdness of it, and just needed somebody to share his encounters with. It wasn't like I was going to be able to run to law enforcement and tell them that this family was murdering their daughter over and over again. Anyway, we stayed close friends for a while, but I feared that one day I would hear his voice calling me from a place I normally wouldn't see him. Well, that never happened, but the chance of it never left my mind. This still stands out in my adult mind as one of the creepiest, eeriest, bizarrest things I've ever experienced, and just proves to me there are far more paranormal and supernatural things going on in this world than we can ever truly comprehend. I used to be a caseworker with CPS. This system ended up taking in custody of a child who was severely disturbed, both schizophrenic and prone to a wide variety of anxiety disorders. So to say that the child had his hands full would be putting it lightly. His parents had simply vanished, and somebody reported that they hadn't seen any adults around the house for a very long time. The boy didn't have much to say about it, but he eventually told workers that he had murdered his parents. He was only 9, and I didn't think this likely, considering the mental challenges he had to cope with. Police did investigate and found zero evidence of any foul play. There were a few signs of domestic struggling, but it was the kind that would have taken place between two adults, not adults and a child. I ended up growing attached to the boy, just because of how distressed he was, and how unusual the case was. We usually get children because the parents harm the kids, not the other way around. I wasn't privy to the more sensitive details, such as how he supposedly killed his parents, and it drove me crazy. I just wanted to help as much as I could, but it was out of my jurisdiction. On an ordinary day, a man and woman showed up at the same time to take the boy. They claimed to be his parents, and they even had all the evidence to prove it. They had his birth certificate, photos, everything that you'd expect parents to have. They said that the sitter they hired had dropped everything and ran out on them while they were abroad. That's when the phone call to CPS was made. All their information checked out perfectly. The only problem was the boy himself. He was terrified of his parents. He wanted nothing to do with them, and he nearly went into convulsions of self-preservation. He would scream that they weren't his real parents, and that it was a trick. They were visibly hurt by this, but also understanding, since their son was mentally ill to a severe degree. As much as he fought it, he had to leave. Something about it all didn't sit right with me, and in the mess of getting the boy out the door with his supposedly real parents, his case file had been left pulled up. The child's statement was that he had let something out of the basement that supposedly killed his parents and began looking and acting like them. He just managed to lock them back down in the basement during a supposed cat and mouse session. He had to endure the sound of his parents calling for him from the basement for days. Then the phone call was made, and our people came to get him. It sounded like the talk of a mentally ill person to me, But when I went to follow up on the well-being of the boy months later, both he and his parents had vanished entirely without a single trace. Nobody heard from them, saw them, and it's left a chill in my bones that has never left. To this day, many years later, I still have no idea what came from them. I got out of that because it was too emotionally strenuous. I now have a completely different career path, and I don't look back. This was one of the most bizarre and chilling cases I've ever worked with. Of course, being in CPS, you deal with a lot of heinous things, but this tops it. Back when I was only 16, I was walking home from school, in high school. I lived in a small rural town at the time, in Indiana. The kind of place where you can afford to feel safe. My only real trouble at the time was bullies, so I made it a point to hang back until nobody was really around before I would walk home. My attackers didn't have the patience to hang around forever. I had been doing this for weeks when I noticed a very large, very strangely marked owl that followed me home. I watched it from the corner of my eye. It would usually just hop from tree to tree, hanging just far enough behind me. If I turned to look at it, it would fly away, or sometimes freeze up. But as long as I didn't look at it directly, it would shadow me. I didn't really think anything of this until one week, when my parents would both be away, and I would be alone for 7 straight days. It sounded fine to me at the time, and it wasn't like I was going to get kidnapped. The first day that I would be alone, I was walking home, and my owl friend was behind me. I was somehow comforted by the animal's presence. It looked like any other barn owl, just that its size and markings were very, very wrong. I tried to find comfort, even in the weirdness. Just as I was heading back into my yard, though, I saw the owl land in one of the many trees. I at the time pretended not to see it. When it looked like it was going to head on in, the owl fluttered to the ground, even though I was looking at it from behind several trees. This is where it gets really, really weird. Now bear with me. I swear, it transformed into a human shape that was a coal gray. It appeared to move with incredible speed to the corner of our house, where it could peer at me from around it. I thought I was hallucinating and losing my mind. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my head. But there it was, still as a statue, staring, waiting for me to do something. I had worked up just enough courage to hurry through the front door and tightly lock it. Instantaneously, somebody on the other side had tried the knob and then knocked gently. I looked through the peephole, thinking somebody must have been waiting, playing a prank, but I couldn't see anything. As soon as I walked away from the door, there was more knocking, and it was much harder and urgent sounding this time. So, I quietly tiptoed to the front door and looked through the hole again. This time, I saw the face of our local mailman, which was ridiculous. Mail was delivered in the morning, around here, not 3 p.m. in the afternoon. I felt almost incapable of leaving the house out of fear for the rest of the week. But I pushed myself through it, and I only left when there were other people out on the sidewalk. I played the coming home game with the owl, or whatever it was. I ignored it every time that it appeared to turn into something and knock on my door. I made an attempt to tell my parents about it when they got back, but you can guess, being parents, what they thought. That I had an overactive imagination at 15 and 16, and that the shadows of the trees can create interesting illusions. The last thing has never come looking for me again, as far as I can tell. But I know what I saw for those 7 days. I have no idea what it was or what it wanted. So, my grandmother used to tell us this super scary story which honestly, I don't even know if she wanted to frighten us to death, but it sure worked. She had grown up as a young child in some remote village in Indonesia, moving to the States in her later teens. There was a legend in her village that naughty children who disobeyed their parents would be taken away by a winged creature in the middle of the night. I don't know about you, but if I thought staying on Santa's good list wasn't reason enough to not misbehave, then the fear of being plucked out of your bed as you slept would sure do it. Apparently, according to my grandmother, she once saw the creature soaring past her window in the middle of the night. She has been quite poorly and unable to sleep, so her mother had her moved her bed over closer to the window so she could have some fresh air and enjoy looking up at the moon and the stars at night. Being a fairly small and poor village, there had been a bit of a scandal when one of the farmers allegedly told that somebody was stealing his fruit. Nobody truly admitted to the crime, and it seemed they had a thief in their midst. That same night, as grandmother was looking out the window, she saw the child stealer, as they had named the creature. It was around the size of an adult human, but its skin was a bright color and completely hairless. It had 2 huge black wings and a face that was reminiscent of a rodent with 2 huge pointy ears. It gave the appearance of a half-human, half-bat-like creature. She said it made this horrendous high-pitched scream and entered the open window of the home opposite. Too frightened to see what happened next, she tells me she huddled down under her own covers, having closed her window quietly. Although she knew that she hadn't been naughty, there was no way that she wanted to be spotted by this thing. And of course, the next morning, there was utter panic in the village, as the small boy from the house opposite of her had been taken, vanished with just a pile of stolen, rotting fruit under his bed. It scared her enough to go through her entire life as a law-abiding citizen, and she installed the same sense of moral code onto my own mother, and then onto us. This story alone was enough to keep my siblings and I out of trouble as kids, even though we were in the U.S. There was no way in hell we were risking the wrath of the child stealer. It might be an old Indonesian tale, but it's something that has stuck with me, even now as an adult. Currently, I am a nighttime security guard at a mall. For the most part, it's a pretty easy job. We don't tend to get a lot of trouble, and to be honest with you, it's mostly just a matter of patrolling through the building, making sure no would-be shoplifters have hidden themselves away, and to be on site when late or very early deliveries come in. Piece of cake. It's fairly new, so there's no creepy stories that can go along with it, unfortunately. However, we do have some high-end stores, but nothing worth holding up, and all the money gets banked every night. We've never had any major raids or robberies, which is why when the alarm system started going nuts one night, over by the sporting goods area, I wasn't too concerned. Sometimes, not often, but it does happen, a raccoon or some other small animal gets into the delivery bay and sets off the motion sensors. That's about the scariest thing I'd come across so far, as that thing was pretty big. However, it just ran out, and I opened the back up, having found no trash to rifle through. So I was expecting the same kind of deal this time. Headed over, coffee in hand, and how worried I was. I turned off the alarms and entered into the store. At first, when I heard the fluttering, I thought, crap, a bird might be harder to scare off initially than a raccoon who just ran out. A bird will usually be a lot more scared and start making a mess of things. Once I got into the back, where all the deliveries are sorted, the flopping got louder, and then I heard a sound that almost made me drop my coffee. It was this terrible, unhuman, ungodly shrieking noise. Again, I wasn't quite frightened, yes. I was startled, as I was expecting a bird noise, not that. But at this point, I wasn't what I would call scared. At least not yet. I hit the lights, still fully expected to be face to face with, I don't know, maybe a large owl or a pigeon. What I instead saw actually did make me drop my coffee and break my mug, reaching for my gun out of reflex. This thing was no bird. It was actually around the size of a large child, maybe a 10 to 12-year-old child to be exact. Completely black. If it hadn't been flapping about, I would have sworn it was a very small would-be robber. The body was very human, except its flesh was jet black, and had very human-like arms and legs. But the head and the wings, yes, this thing had wings. It was very reminiscent of a bat. It had tiny yellow beady eyes, very pointy ears, think like an elf, except longer, very exaggerated and pointed, and very sharp-looking teeth, like little knives. Honest to God, it was some sort of bat-human creature. It made this awful screaming noise, and at that point, in my fight or flight, I had two options. The first would be to shoot it. The second, open the delivery door back up. And you know what? I'm not a murderer, even if this thing was some kind of monster. You see, it wasn't trying to attack me. The screams seemed more like it was panicked, probably because it was trapped, and it was right over by the door. So I released it, and the door opened up, and it flew straight out. After all that, it truly scared the hell out of me. I have no idea what the hell that was, what kind of animal it was, or what it was doing, or how it got in there. But I can confidently say, I never felt like it wanted to attack me or try and hurt me, even though it looked pretty vicious and evil, and like it could have torn me in pieces. I just think it was maybe scared. I don't know. It still boggles my mind to this day. One thing I never did was actually get to see the security footage of it. I'm sure it's lying around somewhere. I like to take a run in the morning before heading off to work, since I am currently a teacher. This means getting up super early, and often when it is still pretty dark. Luckily, most of the tracks and streets around here are fairly well lit, even through the parkland, so it's not often I find myself running in total darkness. One winter morning, however, I desperately needed to get a stretch in before a long day ahead of teaching and Christmas pageant rehearsals. So, I was up even earlier than usual, and it was pretty dark out, despite the streetlights. I see all sorts of wildlife on my runs, and have been scared to death many a time by something running across my path. But I am in their domain, when it is still officially nighttime, so I only have myself to blame, I guess. There are no predators here, though. I am not foolish enough to go running alongside bears or even mountain lions. To be honest, the biggest thing I have ever run across is a possum. They can be sneaky little guys, but again, never bothered me. More like, hey, get out of here. But on this day, something felt weird from that moment I got onto the path. So you know, there's about half a mile through the trees, which isn't really lit until you get back onto the track. This is due to the tall timber. It kind of blocks in a lot of light, especially the angle in which the sun rises. I have ran it so many times I'm confident anyway, but I always have the light on my phone too. On this morning, it was as if I could just tell as soon as I hit the trees that something was going to happen. But I would never have expected to be what actually happened. I could hear commotion overhead, up in the top of the trees that I ran past, Now, there were often birds about to start their day, and squirrels even angry with me, quote-unquote, waking them up. It made me not so concerned. But whatever was going on did seem to be reaching some sort of crescendo. There was a ton of racket. And then, almost like something out of a cartoon, there was a whooshing noise, and in front of me stood what I can only describe to you as a Batman. Literally. I mean, obviously it wasn't Batman. And for just a split second, bearing in mind that he was only illuminated by my cell phone light, I thought it was some loon dressed up as Batman, thinking it was a little early for Halloween. That freaked me out, as I thought maybe I was about to be robbed, when instead of asking me for my wallet, it made this weird high-pitched screaming, spreading its wings. I distinctly remember this. If this is a dude in a costume, he must know somebody in Hollywood, because that thing is super realistic looking. Black and scaly, yellow eyes, sharp little teeth. My mind began to try and compute that this thing in front of me couldn't possibly be a person in cosplay. The body was a weird dark red color, and it was not quite as tall as me. It had human-like arms and legs, but now looking at the face more and more, it was part man and part bat. It couldn't have been a mask. It was too realistic. It made that awful screeching hiss again, and began to flap its wings. It shot up so fast that I didn't even see the direction that it went off in. I hadn't even really looked closely at its feet when I shone the phone light down to where it had been. There were claw marks. It appeared to have some sort of talons. It looked strong enough to pick up a small dog possibly, and carry it away. I ran home, possibly racing as fast as I could. Later on, I found myself running on alternate routes, and never went back on the same route. Now, and ever since then, I only run once the sun has risen. It's an encounter that will stay with me for a long time. Unfortunately, there's only few people I can tell, because, well, due to the nature of the story, who's going to believe me? Thank you for listening. Hi, just wanted to chime in and say I'm a huge fan of the show, and I wanted to send to you a report of my own. I was driving home one night, late after work. A little FYI on me. I work in a hotel, what they call the evening shift or second shift, which means I finish up right about 2 a.m., or as soon as my coworker gets there, which sometimes isn't until 2:15. Since the roads are usually packed in the daytime, it is a quite built-up area, but at 2 a.m., I finally have the place to myself. It's a fairly short commute, so I was really only around 10 minutes from home and bed, when something caught my eye out of the window. Just because I'm the only car on the road at the time, doesn't mean I drive recklessly. You gotta go careful at night, especially considering I've had deer jump out in front of my car. So, when I saw something fly into the trash cans, something that looked huge, I made an effort to slow down, drive past and get a look. I will never forget what stepped out. It was around the size of a small teenager, maybe a large child, a middle schooler maybe. Covered in thick black fur, it appeared, and large claws and talons. It was the weirdest looking thing I'd ever seen. It appeared to have a snout, and reddish amber glowing eyes. I didn't see any teeth, but it had behind it the shape that appeared to be these massive wings. They looked exactly like a bat's, except more tattered. It was like I was looking at a gorilla with the head of a dog almost, and bat-like wings. It's not a super accurate description, but it's the best one I can muster up. What I can't accurately tell you is this thing was incredibly ugly. I don't know what kind of animal it was, but it almost reminded me of a creature you'd see off the movie Army of Darkness. If you've never seen that movie, well, I strongly suggest you watch The Evil Dead, because they are good films. Anyway, I craned on and sort of went, and it disappeared. Anyway, I wanted to know if you've ever received reports of anything similar. Again, I've never seen something like that in my life, and although I do enjoy good horror stories, I had no intention to actually live in one, so you can imagine how scared out of my life I am. Okay, so I know technically there's no skinwalkers in Michigan, but the other night, around 3 in the morning, I was walking down the road, and I saw this herd of deer running across the road, and then right behind them, this thing came out of the woods. It was big, like deer-sized, but its head wasn't on its neck, and it was on its shoulders, and it was way too big to be a coyote or a dog. It ran under a light, and I could see it was colored black, like its skin was black. And I say skin because this creature looked almost leathery, not anything like it was furry. It also cleared the main road in just 2 steps. Boom, boom, gone. We have no bears, no moose, wolves, or buffalo. Nothing that looks like this. And I know 100% this was not a deer. Do you have any ideas? I'm very curious to know if a skinwalker would stalk me. I am absolutely terrified. The past few nights, I've experienced something stalking me. It started out like this on Wednesday, 2 days ago. I was sitting on my porch, smoking a cigarette, when all of a sudden, I heard a kitten screeching. So, me being the big soft baby I am for animals, immediately got up and began to try and find this kitten. But what tripped me out is that it kept moving from place to place until it got into the second part of my yard, which is a field that's pretty tall. That's when I sort of sketched out and went back inside. Then, yesterday, I let out my dogs about 9 or 10 p.m., and I kept hearing weird deep growling. Now, I've lived in the country my whole life, and I've never ever heard a growl quite like that. It was raspy and way too deep and guttural, but I brushed it off as being a scared bear or maybe a wolf. I let my dogs in, and just as I was about to go in myself, I heard an inhuman screeching. So I ran inside and closed all the windows and locked all the doors, and kinda didn't sleep all that well the next day. So I went outside to see if I can find any footprints, but instead, I found human-like footprints, and it really scared me. So that night, I let my dogs out, and my little brother wanted to help. So I let him, as I was walking my husky around. She started acting weird, and kept growling at something behind me. So I turned around and heard a clicking sound, and then like an owl screeching, but like I knew it wasn't an owl. Then, I heard my dear grandmother's voice, so I quickly put my dogs inside, locked the doors again, shutting all windows. I was sitting inside my living room when I heard heavy footsteps on my porch, and then 3 knocks on the window and the door behind me. I don't know what it was. I am just overall terrified. I want to know, if it was a skinwalker, why would it be after me? My husband and I went on our first walk this very morning, after moving to the country. It's not the kind of country where your nearest neighbor is miles away, but we are surrounded by trees and empty fields. As we got about 35 feet away from the bridge or road by our house, we noticed a creature standing on the bridge, just watching us. It looked like someone dressed in all black, staring us down from the left side. We walked closer and realized it was walking away. No matter how fast or slow we walked, it was always the same distance away from us. When we stopped moving, so would the creature. What seemed to change was the shape it would take. As we walked, we could see it hobbling like a drunk person. If we looked away, it would move to the opposite side of the road and be a completely different shape, like a dog or an animal. As we walked onto the bridge, the creature was farther ahead by a hill. It again began to change shape and had stick-like legs. It would walk, but not bend its knees. It was as if it was on stilts. We slowed our pace and began to walk over the hill, still changing shape. We got to the hill, looking ahead to see what shape the creature took, but it was gone. No trace of it in the distance, and we could see a few miles ahead at this point, and no sign of it being there at all. We both thoroughly believe it was a skinwalker, and we're glad we never met up with it. I'm not sure how to begin this. Whatever this is didn't just affect me, but my family in different ways. And it has continued to mess with me for years after we moved from the house where it all began. I'm trying to take something that did many things over several years and just trim it down to details that seem important. And I'm sorry if it reads as weird or awkward. My grandmother was supposed to have traced her side of the family all the way back to an unregistered family of natives that escaped the Trail of Tears. And after telling a person of this strange thing that I normally kept secret, they suggested that it might be a skinwalker. But ultimately, I don't know. I know there was a lot of family strife in that house, where the supposed haunting started, that bubbled up to the surface. A spirit there liked to scare me by calling my name, slamming doors, giving me strange nightmares, and even mimicking the voices of family to other members. The first time I can think of it appearing is when we were coming back from a road trip at night. Dad was driving, and he hits the brakes hard and swerves because he'd seen a wolf with no eyes step out into our lane and look at our oncoming car. Because everybody else was asleep, he was the only one to see it, and there was no body around to suggest that anything had ever physically been there. The second time I think it showed itself was many years after. We had long moved from the house this all began in. I was home alone at night, messaging a friend, and I seen a huge figure walking up the road. I froze in fear as it approached and eventually passed by the house we were living in. And what I remember was something with a strange skull, kind of like that of a monkey skull as a head, or covering its head, and the rest completely hidden behind a cloak of some sort of dark-colored fur. It hasn't been around for a bit now, but while it was around, or possibly pursuing me, it had caused a lot of hardships for me and my family. I remember that if I talked or thought about it too much, it would draw its attention back to me, when it seemed like it had left, and I would have let my guard down. Whatever it is has always made me feel terrified and unsafe. I used to have symbols of protection from whatever religion I can think of to try and find some sort of protection from it. I'm not sure what this entity is, but this is not a story I share much, as I know it sounds, and I don't want to go through the normal ridicule and dismissive comments. While driving from Colorado to California, my wife and I drove through Four Corners at about 3 in the morning. I'm weird, so I like to drive at night and through odd routes. We took Highway 160. We got to a point to where we could either turn right to continue on to 160 or go left. Before getting to the intersection, I seen the sign stating that Shiprock, New Mexico was to the left. So, I decided I wanted to head that way. I was an avid reader of Tony Hilmerman's book, about a Navajo police officer. It was actually a book series, but it's really good. And the stories mostly took place in Shiprock. So, of course, I had a major urge to drive through it. Well, once I got to the intersection, a huge dog appeared out of nowhere and started to block my car. I tried to go around it and make the left turn, but it snarled at me and started to block my car further. So I acted like I was going to make the right-hand turn, and the dog backed off. Well, me being me, decided to screw this and tried to make the left turn to Shiprock when the dog charged at my car and was now growling the most vicious growl I've ever heard from a dog. Well, I tried to trick the dog again, and the dog once again backed off. Well, the last time I tried to make the left, the dog sat right in front of my car and wouldn't budge. It was at this time I said, screw this noise. I'm making the right-hand turn. I was able to go without any further issue. My wife was somewhat freaked out, and she said what the hell was wrong with that dog. I told her that it wasn't a dog. It was indeed a skinwalker. I'd hate to think what would